I will recognize members of the audience. If there is a statement, there will be questions only from committee members. No one else will be asking questions, but there may be, and I know we do have some expertise, people in industry and whatnot that may want to say something, and if they do, we will allow the opportunity for those kinds of statements to be made, but all questions will come from members of the committee. And with that, Representative Morissette, you are recognized to introduce your interim study.
Thank you, Representative Watson. And first I want to say thank you for holding this meeting and being so generous with the time we're going to have this morning. Just as a quick note, Representative Watson and I come from different parties, but he and I are really close friends. I'm going to miss you, my friend. We'll see you around at some of the ball games, I'm sure. I want to thank everybody for coming this morning, and thank the chairman again for allowing the vice chairman for allowing this important interim study to move forward. The title of this interim study is Options to Wastewater Injection. As the title of our study indicates, we are here today to discuss options to wastewater injection. That means we are also here to speak about the production of gas and oil and wastewater recycling techniques. Let me first say, and I want to make this real clear to everyone in this room and anybody that's listening, let me say that I am not opposed to the production and the use of gas and oil. And in fact, Oklahoma has, for 109 years of statehood, relied upon the oil and gas industry for energy production, jobs, taxes, and much more. I do, however, have serious issues with any production technique that ignores, first, the value of preserving clean water, second, all other aspects of the environment, and three, the very lives and property of our residents. I have never now or in the past been opposed to fracking. However, fracking involves the subsequent production of the byproduct called, quote, produced water or brine water, unquote. Where do energy companies go with this byproduct after they extract the gas and the oil, question mark? Presently, oil and gas companies return this wastewater back into the earth by way of high-pressure injection. Oklahoma is now the man-made earthquake capital of the world, and scientists agree that the majority of these quakes are being caused by high-pressure injection of this wastewater. As a result of these man-made earthquakes, many Oklahomans now have extensive property damages to homes, businesses, as well as our historic buildings. And for the energy industry does not yet fully understand the long-term impact for this injecting of this wastewater. For example, how long will we experience earthquakes? Or what harm does this activity pose for our freshwater aquifers? The frustration over these concerns is growing. So what's the solution, question mark? For decades, many of you in this room have been advocating for the development of alternative energy, only to be met with high-powered opposition from the forces connected with some of the short-sighted established members producing fossil fuels. With decades now having passed, the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates the oil industry will survive for a minimum of 25 more years at current rates of consumption, while the United States remains without a reliable, ready source of alternative energy. In general, sources agree we have until around the year 2057 before we see an end to known oil supplies, and there is no target date for switching to any alternative energy resources. We've all heard the kinds of talk about how the fossil fuel industry creates jobs, particularly in Oklahoma, for Oklahomans, which in fact they do. The alternative fuel industry also creates jobs. It seems we need to do two things just as fast as we can, Mr. Chairman. One is to invest in alternative energy ways, and two, find a way in the meanwhile to produce gas and oil, limiting the damage to the environment and to the lives and property. I'm going to repeat this, be real clear. Find a way in the meanwhile to produce gas and oil, limiting the damage to the environment and to lives and property. As a more efficient way to produce gas and oil, what if we stopped injecting wastewater as a concept? Would it help? The answer is yes. We know from recent efforts by the Oklahoma Corporation Commission that reducing wastewater volumes correlates to experiencing fewer earthquakes. We know that to be, at this point, a fact. And we can safely assume that if we stop injecting, we will also hedge against fouling our freshwater supplies. Some representatives of the energy industry have been quick to reject options to wastewater disposal that involve recycling, stating that these known options place too much a financial burden on the fossil fuel industry until or unless the industry sees a significant rise in the per barrel price of oil. I have with me today several individuals presently working in the area of wastewater recycling who say that the industry is simply, quote, wrong. And they are here to prove that such recycling can be effective and affordable. Before I turn the meeting over to our presenters, let me confirm that there is a cost involved in recycling, and that cost should be borne by those who benefit from both the sale and the consumption of fossil fuels. Let me also state for the record that I believe we must employ, and this is a concept that we've tried over several sessions that have been rejected, but I guess if we're going to grow an oak tree, Mr. Chairman, we need to plant the seed today. Let me also state for the record that I believe we must employ what is called a public-private partnership, or P3 formula, that distributes an equitable cost versus benefit across the board for any recycling method adopted by the state of Oklahoma. What should a funding model for wastewater recycling P3 look like? And from there, where we might find some funding. Here are some ideas I'd like to present to the committee. First, it's not just Oklahomans, but every American who benefits from the gas and oil produced in Oklahoma. Because Oklahoma has been proactive in the production of domestic oil, our nation is now nearly energy independent of foreign oil. So federal tax dollars derived from those Americans consuming Oklahoma energy could and should be considered a possible source of funding for a portion of the P3 model. Secondly, in the packet I provided the committee here today, there are materials. You have an article explaining the need for Oklahoma as an energy state to establish a sovereign wealth trust fund. Oklahoma is among 9 states to draw more than 5% of its revenue from severance taxes, and that leaves us in a volatile position, and such a fund could stabilize our funding base. A sovereign wealth trust fund is set up much as any trust fund would, to include the Commission of the Land Trust or the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, and from such a fund, we could draw contributions from our wastewater recycling P3 model. Thirdly, also in your package is information about the status of a fuel tax increase in Oklahoma to help with P3. Now, using that word tax, I'm sure it just drove shivers through some people in this room. But by comparison, in Oklahoma, to help the P3, just for comparison, presently Oregon, which has nearly an identical population as Oklahoma, now has a 30% gallon tax on gasoline. Kentucky has 29.4% per gallon tax. Arkansas, 21.5 per gallon. Tennessee and Louisiana, both at 20 cents. Idaho at 25 cents, and so on. And diesel taxes usually run a little bit higher. Oklahoma hasn't raised its tax since the early 80s and remains standing at 16 cents for gasoline and 13 cents for diesel fuel. There is no way for Oklahomans to do much in the way of transportation infrastructure or to fund innovations such as oil and gas-related wastewater recycling if the tax remains as low as 16 cents a gallon. Fourth and lastly, let's talk about the adjustments to tax incentives for the oil and gas industry and the deregulation of how adjustments might benefit the proposed P3 recycling effort. 2 years ago, the state lawmakers voted to keep in place some of the lowest taxes on the industry production in the United States, a break that was worth $470 million in fiscal year 2015 alone. As Representative Watts and I and the other members of the committee have experienced over the last couple of sessions, the trouble we are having in finding revenue sources and balancing our budgets. These are just examples of what I want to stress, that the total cost of recycling should not be the sole responsibility of the oil and gas industry. We all need to share in the cost as we all use petroleum-based products. And I'm almost finished. Legislators and regulators play an important role. They are the very voice and the protection of the people they represent. Citizens of Oklahoma, the citizens of Oklahoma. I've included a sample letter from a constituent, a Ms. Ramona Brock, who emailed my office with the message I am hearing from hundreds of Oklahomans. Ms. Brock put together a powerful letter that sums up the fear and concern Oklahomans now have. They want something done to protect their homeland from destruction. It's people like Ramona Brock who deserve better. She called my office recently to quote the governors of Florida, Georgia, South and North Carolina, who during Hurricane Matthew stated that there is a concern for security and safety. We have to put the people first. She's asking, why didn't we put the people first when we considered high-pressure wastewater injection techniques that have been known to be a threat to life and property since the days of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal earthquakes in Colorado. On October 21st of this year, there was a meeting held in Tulsa that included regulators, attorneys, and scientists, the kind of people some in the industry want to cut out of the process. And these folks met to discuss how to encourage wastewater recycling. An attorney by the name of Terry Stowers, who was a speaker for the Oklahoma Bar Association, said that we need more incentives to encourage recycling, and Corporation Commissioner Dana Murphy agreed. So, maybe the P3 idea is something we can employ. With support of these people, and despite some in the industry that want to protect and do nothing except keep the status quo. The status quo, folks, does not work to serve the best interests of the citizens of Oklahoma. With all that is at stake, we no longer have the luxury to be at odds with each other. This interim study is my last official act after 12 years in the House of Representatives. I hope, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman, that this information will put forth is used in a constructive way to resolve the serious dilemma facing our state and our nation connected to the production of energy and the need to protect the public and the environment. So,
Mr. Morissette, before you go on, before you go to introduce your presenters, the Vice Chair would like to be recognized.
Representative Morissette, I don't disagree on, but item 4, I want the people to know in here, we doubled the gross production tax and we cut it by 1 year 2 years ago. So we didn't just not do anything. It was at 1% for 4 years. And, okay, if you'll look at drilling around the country, Oklahoma is very active. We have rigs running the Scoop, the Stack, other places in Oklahoma. We're in North Dakota and places where they have 7, 11% gross production tax. Their drilling is not near like what we have here in Oklahoma. So we are still producing oil, and we're still have jobs even through this downturn in the oil and gas business.
May I respond, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
This is one of the things I'm going to miss most about this body, Mr. Chairman Watson, is the lively debate that the Vice Chairman and I will have had in the past.
And we are good friends.
Absolutely. Will be now and in the future. But I disagree with you. I believe that vote that we took, and I don't want to get into a long diatribe, Mr. Chairman, was worth $470 million. And if we look at our school districts today and other needs of this state, I bet we could have used that money in a very constructive manner. But with that, unless there are any more questions, Chairman Watson, I would like to present my first presenter, who I have great respect for, and I think this committee does, Professor Todd Hallahan, Ph.D. from the Oklahoma State University School of Geology, has been one of the leading voices in this subject, and I appreciate his time for coming here today. And may I present Professor Hallahan, Mr. Chairman.
Professor, you're recognized.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. I appreciate the invitation, and I was checking my notes yesterday, and I was here almost 2 years ago today for my first round of this topic. In terms of this topic, most people don't really worry about geology. There's not a lot of phone calls for understanding injection wells until you start having earthquakes. So that changes things a bit, and we're going to talk about some of the science on this. If you got questions, just let me know and we can go through those and try to make sure the topic's clear. I'm at Oklahoma State University, and that's the land-grant extension university in this state that is supposed to provide information to folks. When I give talks about this topic, it is a sensitive topic, and people have lots of opinions. The university would like me to mention that I'm not a spokesman for the university. I'm a professor at the university that knows something about the topic, and so they're welcome to get insight, but they have lots of constituencies. But their goal as a university is to make sure that information gets out. So I'm speaking as a guy who works there, but I'm not speaking for the university. We'll go through 5 things. They're numbered at the bottom of the slides. If you're nodding off somewhere in the middle, if you wake back up, you can see where you're at out of the 5 things. We'll start with context as to why we're here. We're looking at wastewater and the two components are that Oklahoma has the largest change in seismicity in history. We are not the most seismically active place in history, we're the biggest change in history. We're also running one of the world's largest industrial wastewater facilities, and we're doing that on an incredibly cheap basis in terms of all the things you could invest in to manage that type of facility. You're running a very, very large industrial wastewater disposal facility, and the investment in understanding that facility has not been made. It's being run on roughly a 1930s, 1950s scientific standard. In terms of why I'm here, people want to understand science, but basically a lot of scientists are asked to play on one team or another. This is pretty complicated as a situation, and so there's government entities, there's a lot of commercial entities, there's a lot of residents of the state that are concerned about this, and I try to provide the technical reality. If at any point somebody feels like I'm trying to be overly biased towards some entity or another, and that's gotten more complicated over time as to what these different potential teams are, I always let people to let me know. I try to provide the data and the facts available and the different options available to people, but I try not to play on one of the teams. Some things that put us in context for situations with geology. If you have situations with the medical industry, the TV will put on somebody that has a medical degree to explain a new pill or a new device or a new surgery. On TV, most times with geology, it's passionate politicians. No offense, they're good for doing a lot of things, but explaining science is not typically one of them. Or they put on a passionate movie star that's very passionate about the topic, but it'd be useful, very similar to medical, if they used people that were trained in the topic. One of the reasons I give talks and have social issues of doing that, it's because it's not typically been done. Another one that's a real problem for the industry is it's very hard for the industry when there's hundreds of companies involved to not have somebody communicate whether people are doing things properly. And there's a wide range of practices across the industry, but there's no neutral ref that's coming out to say we're going to look at this problem and tell you why that went wrong. It works very well for the airline industry. They make money doing things. They have accidents. They don't want accidents, but they have a great deal of trouble in the oil industry communicating that to the public because of the ability to not have a neutral rep to communicate that. And finally, on the problems of trying to communicate this is once the public loses trust, which a lot of folks in Oklahoma have communicated to me that they don't trust particular entities, whether that's the government or whether that's commercial companies, public relations or having meetings like this doesn't make that trust immediately build back up. So that's the context of trying to do this work. In terms of my background, I've got a background in physics and geology. I'm a registered professional geophysicist in California because there is no such thing as a registered professional geophysicist in Oklahoma. You cannot be a registered professional geologist nor a geophysicist. Oklahoma doesn't have such a program. Most other states do, but this one does not. I've worked in the arbuckle, which is the formation that the injection interval of concern is. I've worked in hydrogeology, I've worked in industry, I've worked across these different lines, and so I have a background that ends up making me useful to talk about these things. And scientifically, I publish in the arena, and on a Daubert standard, if you think more about the legal things, I can probably pass a Daubert standard to communicate this information. When I was here 2 years ago, I used this slide to talk about the certainty about Oklahoma seismicity and talked about that we got up to the 51 percentile and that the preponderance of evidence indicated that Oklahoma seismicity was generated by injection wells in the state. We've probably migrated up into the clear and convincing evidence, but I'm told by some folks that about 2/3 of the people that communicate with them are still uncertain about the connection between Oklahoma seismicity and injection wells. So we're going to walk through that just a little bit to walk through why that evidence is pretty strong at this point and has moved up in the last couple of years. In terms of probable cause, some of the injection rates that are published for Oklahoma wells relative to sites that we know were generating earthquakes due to injection, we are way above that. We are not a surprising case. The surprising case for our injection rates would be that you didn't generate seismicity. So the rate we are at is quite high for the published cases, and I'm trying to use published cases as the evidence for these particular pieces. So we're not, hey, wow, this is kind of surprising. We're injecting at such a low rate and we're still getting earthquakes. The injection rates that we were dealing with are very, very high. Relative to coming up with an understanding of what are the rules for injecting and not generating earthquakes, we violate rule number 1 in that we inject very close to the basement with a formation that is likely hydraulically connected into the basement rocks. And those are the granites underneath Oklahoma where the seismicity is occurring. For flow charts of thinking about what the rules would be for dealing with seismicity, rule number 1 from Davis and Froelich is, are you near the basement? Yes. Oh, we'll stop and reevaluate what you're doing. Well, we started in the 1930s, so stopping when it started happening to us around 2009, that wasn't simple to do. But relative to being a probable cause that this could cause seismicity, the rates and location of this injection make it a very likely cause. Relative to having earthquakes, there's a number of people that talked about Oklahoma being a seismically active state, and we're earthquake country. We weren't earthquake country. Having a seismic swarm and having a few earthquakes, we should be having about 2 per year. We generally have at least 2 per day. So having 907 in a year above magnitude 3, that isn't that you have a slight signal and it's somewhat mysterious, it's that you've had a really distinct change. And the state acknowledged this in 2015. The Oklahoma Geologic Survey and the governor's office during that year both acknowledged that there's a correlation with disposal wells. And that's pretty strong for the state to come out and say that and indicate that they feel that connection is strong enough. Since that time and during that time, there's been a lot of published research on this now. There is more coming out, and so there's additional research that'll be continuing to be published, and the case is not getting weaker over time. So folks at Columbia, folks at Stanford, folks in Colorado, folks from the United States Geologic Survey have all published peer-reviewed scientific work indicating the connection between injection wells in this state and the seismicity that we've been feeling. And another piece of really distinct evidence is that in places where you've decreased injection rates, you have less earthquakes. So all these pieces together, I think folks were hoping that they could kind of ignore it a bit and it would go away, but unless you decrease the injection, it doesn't go away, and it becomes very hard to hide it because now this is one of the most interesting places seismologists have to study on the planet. So there's a lot of folks that look at this, and the evidence is being collected on all sorts of different scientific studies. So the odds of it just disappearing from the scientific literature is now absolutely negligible. So for the folks that go, well, if we just ignore this longer, it'll go away and won't be a problem, and they won't be able to prove it, that was unlikely 2 years ago. It's extremely unlikely now. In terms of making an earthquake, folks have said, you know, man's not capable of making an earthquake. Actually, we're quite good at it. We've been doing it since the late 1800s in terms of scientifically documented cases of making seismicity. It started with South African miners, and if you're 4 kilometers underneath the earth and you're going to make an earthquake, it makes you very nervous. So they're quite good at managing that. Surface reservoirs, such as when we built the Hoover Dam and started seeing earthquakes from doing really, really large surface reservoirs. We came up with rules of how do you fill and drain a large surface reservoir. And so we came up with the rules for that. For injection seismicity, we started the understanding of it back in the 1960s. We didn't start getting management rules sort of until the 90s, and most of the management has been sort of isolated cases, and what we'll do is we'll shut it all off. Oklahoma has a trouble with that because we have a lot of wells and we have sort of an actively running system, and quick shut off of the whole thing is not particularly practical. It's an option, but it's not a simple one for this state. So the concept of managing injection seismicity, that started in the 80s, and in the 90s people started thinking about how do we manage systems that may be seismically active and what protocols do we use. So we have been thinking about that for some time, but it's still a young science in terms of being really quite efficient at it. Couple different mechanisms to make one. One is you can put a bunch of mass on the earth, and usually we do that with a surface reservoir and we fill it up with water. You can do that and you can watch the earth change by moving around trains, putting up buildings, anything with a lot of mass, or you can remove it. You can drain a reservoir, drain out a mine, and you can generate seismicity. The other way to do it is to get fluid pressure to alter the pressure around a fault that wants to move and get it to slide. That's the mechanism that Oklahoma is believed to be using for generating the seismicity around here. If we look at the mass change, this is an example from quite long ago where we look at a train coming into a station and watch the water level in a well. When the train comes into the station, the water level goes up because you put a whole bunch of mass in the ground. It comes up about 1/4 inch. So we can detect it. It's kind of interesting. It's not a big pressure change. Train leaves the station, it drops back down, and then comes back to normal. So you can push on the earth and you can generate a pressure pulse. The same thing happens on a bigger scale when you do surface water reservoir storage. Filling those up really fast when it's a really big reservoir is a problem, but the rules have been developed since roughly the 1930s on how to manage that, and it's not a 10-foot change that we're talking about. It's hundreds of feet of change in water level that provides enough mass to provide enough pressure pulse to generate seismicity. So we've worked with surface water reservoirs a long time, and that mass change around Oklahoma existed as reservoirs had rainfall or had droughts, and ours aren't big enough for most of them to be generating big pressure pulse changes at depth. Our version is something like when you go to Silver Dollar City and look at the big sphere fountain and have little kids move around a big ball of granite. The one in this picture is about 17,000 pounds, and if you put a pool pump underneath it, you can move around a 17,000 pound sphere of granite. You do that because the pressure underneath it allows the friction to go down. It's not the water's not squirting out all over the place. It's not huge high pressure. It's the pressure change and allowing that friction to decrease such that things can move around. That's the same thing that's happening at depth here, except for it's the added pressure from injection wells at depth. In terms of our knowledge of this, we've already heard mention of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal case. It went very similar to Oklahoma's case in that it wasn't an oil and gas activity. This was a wastewater disposal facility for really fun stuff we invented back in World War II and we wanted to dispose of. So they went into the bottom of Colorado and they started to inject in a place that was under pressure, and so that would have room to take the fluids, and they put it down there and they changed the pressure down there. They started getting seismicity. They said it's not us. People debated that. They stopped injecting. They debated it some more. They started injecting again, made more earthquakes. And so that injection rate was about 4 million gallons per month, and they decided just to shut down the system altogether because they couldn't control the seismicity and they weren't sure what to do next. Some features about that: those earthquakes don't show up right next to your injection well. So in most cases, when you look at these cases across the country or across the world, when you have an injection well generating seismicity, the earthquakes don't pop up right next to the injection well. And people have used that as evidence saying, look, it can't be our injection wells, the earthquakes aren't right next to it. That's the common case. It'd be a very strange case to have the earthquakes right at the injection well. So there's a circle on that diagram, a 5-kilometer radius, and you can see most of the earthquakes are further away than that. On average, they're about 10 kilometers away from the injection wells. So when you look at these features and people say, well, it's not right next to the injection well, it can't be the injection wells, we've never seen cases where it's hanging out right next to the injection well unless there's some weird things going on, or you're measuring really tiny earthquakes watching rocks fracture, which we've done previously. The quakes continue for some time after you shut down the injection, depending on how the earth is relaxing and how the pressures are decaying around that injection well. In this case, I was told that the earthquakes went on for roughly 15 years. They weren't felt seismicity, they were small earthquakes for most of them, but for the next year after they stopped injection, they did have some significant seismicity. After that occurred, it was at a time where we were pretty sure we were going to get very good at understanding earthquakes. We were going to predict them, we were going to control them. We're not so confident in these things anymore, but back then we were, and there was a paper published called An Experiment in Earthquake Control. And what they were going to do is look at, could we put injection wells along the San Andreas and slide California along to prevent large earthquakes. And so what they did was they utilized an oil field in Colorado. They were injecting at a rate even lower than Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and they were generating seismicity, some of them near the injection wells, a lot of them away from the injection wells. And so that gave us the beyond a reasonable doubt test that you can inject water and generate your own earthquakes. If we look at where those are at, the ones in black on this chart are the ones that are within a kilometer of the experimental wells. The ones in orange are further away. So you can see that the common case is that the earthquakes are not going to occur right next to the well, that they're going to be some distance away. In Oklahoma, that makes it complicated in that if you go a few kilometers away from an injection well, you find another injection well. And so trying to pin down which injection well it is in Oklahoma is quite tricky because of the density of injection wells. For most of these classic cases, there were very few wells in a small area that you could keep track of the problem a lot better. For surface water reservoirs, if we look at somebody getting a concussion, and if you have a cop go out and get hit in the head with something large by a felon of some sort, and he comes in and the boss hits him in the back of the head, and they say, well, he has a concussion, which do you think it was? You can measure the forces involved. And so when people talk about our surface water reservoirs and generating seismicity, the changes we see in there are not big enough. What they may do, and they're working on this in Arkansas, and the paper's not out yet, but they're working on, if you have a reservoir fill up and you're generating pressures from injection, can you help to kick them off because you're adding more to the situation? And so it may be that we get some publications coming out saying that in places where we're injecting, being near a full reservoir that's just filled up seems to have even more problems, but it's not the primary cause. It'd be a secondary issue. When it comes to management, there's a lot of options. I'm not trying to tell you one of these options is the best option. There's a whole bunch of people involved with making these decisions, and I'm going to talk about some of the various options. One of them is a straight ban on injection. In seismically active zones in Oklahoma, that's been selected for some areas. They've said, look, in this area, we're going to shut down injection until we understand what's going on in this area. So that's one choice. There's a lot of economic implications for that, and people are trying to decide what that should do. But in the case of reactive measures relative to high levels of seismicity, that's been the method the state has selected for some areas. The previous method was if we don't watch these things and we kind of ignore it, it'll all go away. That method is no longer strongly in use, although some people are still trying to utilize that method. I'm not sure what else to call that method of ignoring it other than the ostrich method, so there might be a technical name. There could be, there's a lot of companies that have injection wells and they're trying to make money. And so if the other folks in the neighborhood are employing practices that generate seismicity and they're getting shut down when they're not generating seismicity, that's a problem for them. And so trying to understand how to work between companies that have different data sets and different protocols, one way to do it is to set a maximum rate, either on the total injection rate, and you could do that relative to other studies of looking at what's commonly a rate that doesn't cause seismicity in these other areas around the country or around the world. Or if you got more specific to Oklahoma, you could define it for what we see in Oklahoma as a reasonable rate of injection into the Arbuckle. So that could either be set based on the literature or set based on additional studies, but you could set a maximum rate of, I know that your injection well might be able to take more water, but you're only allowed to go this high. Another version would be to look at the maximum water cut and going, okay, if you drilled a dry hole and you didn't get any oil, you would consider that a loss. You would plug and abandon that well and go away. There could be the wet version of that, that you have so much water you're producing per barrel of oil that it's too much, and you're going to consider that a loss and have to plug and abandon the well. And that would help in terms of if somebody is doing a good job on the geology and generating 10 barrels per barrel of oil on some of these wet formations, and somebody's got a nearby well that's generating 50 barrels, that could have been 5 more good wells that were installed relative to that large water producer. And so if you took out some of those high-end ones, it could help overall with the situation. Studies would need to be done and understand whether that protocol is useful. but those sorts of protocols of trying to put limits on things or deal with some of the really very, very wet producers could be a useful way to manage the total injection rate over an area. A lot of the discussion today is going to be for alternative methods of disposal. Disposal's cost sensitive. Per barrel injection costs are about 50 cents a barrel. That goes up and down with the range of things, so that's just a rough number. But if somebody comes in and says, I've got a great method of disposal, it'll only cost you $40 a barrel, well, that's great, but you're only getting $40 a barrel, so you spent all the money disposing of the water. You didn't make anything on the oil or all the other costs you had. So it's a cost-sensitive thing to look at alternative methods. Are they economically possible, or do you shut down the field? The other question when you go to other alternatives is what waste products might be generated and how are those waste products going to be disposed of? There's a lot of other choices, but those are questions that need to be asked. One of the ways that a lot of folks are going with their wastewater now is to find an alternative location to inject into. Generally, they're injecting shallower into the subsurface. The question with that is, for those formations, are there connections back to the shallow subsurface, either naturally with the geology in the area or due to leftover wells that were never plugged way back in the day, and those things are scattered through Oklahoma at various locations. It's something that you got to consider. The Arbuckle has done a very good job in its history of avoiding impacts to shallow groundwater because it's below all the oil fields. If you come up shallow, it's a question of if you've got lots of companies that all choose the same shallow interval and they're injecting and they find that there's a connection back to shallow groundwater, that needs to be understood relative to those impacts that are potentially there. You could decrease the overall uncertainty in this problem, which the state has not done a particularly proactive job in doing, but you could get a model of the reservoir's flow. Oklahoma has been building groundwater models to manage fresh water for many, many years, but they're not managing where the water goes in the Arbuckle. It's disposed of, it disappears, it's just currently magical. And we've got some hypotheses on where it goes, but there's no real data explaining, here's the maps, here's where it goes, here's how we're managing it, and here's how, if you've got 10 wells in a particular area, here's how we think they're going to interact. So those pieces would be very useful to help guide companies when they're placing wells and they're setting them up as to what would be a useful thing to do in terms of disposal so that they can be safe about it. The other component that really is way out of my bailiwick is to make sure that when I talk to people on the legal and regulatory side, they've got a huge amount of uncertainty either in the government or in the companies about what to deal with for knowledge that they may have about the geology in an area. A company may say, you know, we think we're going to have a problem injecting here and we know these pieces of data. We're not going to buy those leases. But there's no great way for them to tell somebody else that, by the way, you don't want to have people putting injection wells in that spot. And getting that data communication improved, which has knowledge and data that costs people money and is worth money to people, getting some way to deal with that for the safety issues to make sure other companies don't get into a situation where they're making the company that knew look bad. Getting that data exchanged is tricky, but if you can do that, that would be useful on this issue. And that could be a neutral party that collects info and doesn't disclose commercially useful information, but that deals with the safety data for a range of companies. And we have, it's not like one or two companies are running these injection wells. We've got hundreds of companies that are trying to manage this. So it's a complicated problem, and lowering that uncertainty would be useful. In terms of managing people, there's situations around the world where already people are doing this. Paradox Valley, Colorado has been managing this since the 90s. We're managing a case in Southern California. The gas field in the Netherlands, they've been managing seismicity. They've been damaging houses that are 400 years old. So they've had to set up a fund to help pay for damage. They've had to look at managing seismicity. The nice thing for them is they've got a government entity and they got basically one company running things. So they don't have the complexity of this interaction among different companies. They can manage their seismicity much easier because they have a simpler problem to solve in Oklahoma. But there's people that have been dealing with this longer than us and that can provide some guidance. One thing that's key for us that has been difficult to communicate is for people management, getting the number of the earthquake, which you tend to get on the news, is one thing, but the folks on the coast don't understand that number relative to Oklahoma because our attenuation is different. So when you have somebody in California say, well, they're getting 3s and 4s and they're upset about it, Californians kind of giggle. They go 3 and 4s. Those aren't interesting. They are here. Our attenuation is different, and so if we look at our modified Mercalli scale, which is the Roman numerals you'll get with these earthquakes, we get up to, our maximum so far have been up around 8, which are earthquakes where you'll have chimneys collapse and some buildings damaged. And that's sort of the range we think the top of these will be, but folks in California hear our number on the Richter scale and they go, well, how bad could that be? And it's a lot different here. So understanding the attenuation of what the effect is at the surface is quite useful for understanding what people are feeling and what damages might occur. And so there's people working on that relationship for Oklahoma, utilizing the data that people submit when they feel earthquakes. So if we look at a couple of those, here's the 5.8 earthquake that we've had recently in Oklahoma, and the Did You Feel It map. People submitted 60,000 roughly notifications that, hey, we felt that 5.8, and that went from roughly Chicago to Houston. In California, 150 people noticed a 5.8 on this particular map. It's a much smaller scale, and it wasn't a big interesting thing for them because they didn't have as much shaking occurring at the surface. So the relationship between the Richter magnitude and what people are feeling at the surface, understanding the smallest ones is quite useful. So if you feel a small earthquake and you go, well, I'm not going to submit that to the website because it wasn't that interesting, those little tiny ones are the really interesting ones to help build up the data set. The really big ones, we know people felt those. But classifying any damages on large ones and classifying how small that people feel are really very, very useful data for building up this understanding for the science of this. But this is generated by people submitting that information. It's been quite problematic to get schools to do earthquake drills. It's something else on their schedule. They've got other things that they're trying to get done, but it's a very simple thing, and people around here don't know what to do. So having them know what to do in school and going home to tell their parents what to do becomes a very, very useful safety measure, because just knowing that you need to get down and not run around and run out of the building is a very, very useful thing to tell people. There's a website that's shakeout.org. And that provides all the instructions if you happen to be somebody who's running a school and you go, yeah, I'd like to run an earthquake drill, but I don't know step 1 that you would do. It tells you step 1 that what you do. It gives you handouts, it gives you slides, it tells you everything you would need to do to run an earthquake drill so that people could be aware and protected against those sort of events. And the state has a website that's quite good, and if people want to add to that website information of a scientific nature that they say, hey, this one's not up on the website yet, the state's been very responsive to make sure the science is up to date on that website, and so it provides that kind of information people might need. And if you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Professor Hallahan. Appreciate you being here today, taking time to come in and speak to us. I would ask if there's any questions by any of our committee members. Representative Hardin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In injection well, how fast does water normally travel through the soil?
Through the formation?
Through the formation, yes.
So in the formation it's being injected into, there's a pretty wide range because there's void spaces down there. And so there's places where it will take as much as you can put into the pipe. And so the travel speeds might be kilometers per day.
Per day? Okay. So is that the reason that we have such high injection pressures, to force more water into something that wouldn't normally travel as fast? Is that what we're...
So the variability is quite high. And so some wells can take a huge amount, others can't. Some places might be filling up in the area, but there's no large-scale monitoring by the state that is sort of keeping track of that whole system. So there's a lot of variability. What you would normally do is, on the freshwater side, for example, if you had an agriculturally active area you're trying to keep track of, you would keep track of the water levels and make predictions so that for the next irrigation season you can make plans of how things are working, and we do that on a modeling basis of keeping track of square miles of groundwater. On the reservoir basis for producing oil or for injecting waste, you can do the same thing of keeping track of how much fluid is going into an area and what are the properties in that domain. We don't have such a model for the Arbuckle. The Arbuckle is the old school method of putting in the well, assuming no other wells are around, and injecting, and it turned out Arbuckle is really, really nice because in a lot of places you can inject all you could possibly want.
Yes, continue.
Thank you, sir. Is there a way to determine the faults, how high up in the soil they go or where they begin at?
For a lot of the faults that we have, they were found when the seismicity occurred, and so if you get enough seismicity, you can map out that fault. A lot of the faults are strike-slip, meaning that the pieces of rock are moving past each other, and they're not incredibly obvious on seismic. So some of them we know about, other ones we do not. One of the other problems is there's sort of a disconnect between understanding where the faults are and where the injection wells should be placed. And so understanding that information and utilizing it well, it's sort of inconsistent across the state.
Any other questions from members? Representative Morissette, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dennis, excuse me 1 second, please. Ask a question. Maybe 2 questions, Mr. Chairman. One thing you did not get into in any of your presentation, Doctor, is the future predictability of seismic activity if we continue doing what we're doing. You didn't address that.
Right. So
why?
When I'll answer that in question form, but in talk form I try to list what's the peer-reviewed scientific knowledge at that point. For future efforts, the state could take efforts to do some geophysical evaluation of the faulting and the structure down there, and also to monitor the pressures and understand how these wells are interacting and how much pressure they're generating. And you could then get to a management protocol. One of the concerns for long-term is the more earthquakes you generate is to what the distribution is relative to large ones. And there's very few large ones, there's lots of small ones. And so how does that distribution work, and when do you get larger ones? What's the largest one that could be there? And there's debate in the scientific literature. If you look at McGarr trying to decide what the largest would be, he points to the case of the Prague earthquake and says, look, relative to how I think this should work, that's about as big as you're going to make. And we've had one that was pretty similar size recently. There's other folks that say, well, if you've got one that's ready to go that's larger, that's something you'd want to worry about. But it's unclear how that might work in the distributions. So there's debate about it. Thus far, our demonstrations have been that McGarr is right, but if a larger one came along, somebody else in the literature would say, well, see, I thought you could do that.
Follow-up?
So it's something to be concerned about.
Something to be concerned about. Very good. Second question. As far as the fault lines in Oklahoma, many people have the perception that the fault line runs north to south, from Kansas to Texas, but in fact it runs east to west, and the Mississippi Lime Formation does run north and south, but the fault zone runs perpendicular to it. Is that accurate?
So if you go to the OGS website, they've actually got the fault map posted for the known faults in their database, and it's nice in that they've highlighted the ones that are at the angle that would like to move, and it's actually the ones that are on a diagonal through the state. So if you look at the Cimarron River running through Fairview, that's about the angle you're looking at for wanting to move, or 90 degrees to that. And that map will highlight in red, hey, these are the ones that are at the angle that would like to move, and so these are the ones that we know are there, we want to be careful around. So that mapping's ongoing. The quake that happened recently up in Pawnee was on a fault that wasn't on that map. It was orthogonal to one that they were worried about. So knowing where they're at is useful, but a lot of them that have happened we didn't know about until they moved.
Representative Johnson, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the graphs you showed, I think, had 1.6 on one side and 900 something on the other side that had to do with frequency of earthquakes. I think you mentioned that one of the numbers would be if we had no injection wells in the state at all. Would that be like the 1.6 number of earthquakes annually? Does that represent that?
That's assumed to be somewhere around the background rate.
Okay. Are there areas in the state where, you mentioned something in the Arbuckle where the volume of liquid would really be almost unlimited without affecting any kind of seismic activity? Could there be areas targeted where those wells could be used exclusively without going, and maybe exempting other areas where they couldn't inject and go to these areas where they could?
So in terms of taking as much water as you can give, it's not relative to seismicity, it's relative to what the well will take. So most places that are injecting, you are limited in how hard you can inject because the formation will only take so much. The Arbuckle is one of the most transmissive injection intervals on the planet, and so it takes a lot of water. That doesn't mean you won't generate seismicity. And so a lot of the high injection rate areas are where seismicity has occurred. But if you had a good understanding of the formation and could manage between companies and how they're designing their wells and how they're injecting, such that, well, you know, this guy's doing a good job and he's following the rules, and 10 more guys line up next to him and follow the same rules, well, now you've got a bigger problem. And so you have to manage both the design and use of the well, but also, in this case, you have to manage the various companies that are in one area. So if you had a model basis where you said, we're going to manage this per kilometer or something, and said, okay, you're in this block with these other guys, and these are the rules to make sure that since you're both occupying that same space, that you guys will all follow the same rules, but you won't have double the problem because there's two guys operating. So you've got to manage several things at the same time.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative McBride?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I got a question and a follow-up. Just to clarify, you are retained as an attorney for the Sierra Club?
I am not.
You are not?
I'm not playing expert witness for anybody.
You are not an expert witness in the lawsuits on the property damage?
I am not. Because in terms of communicating this information, the things I didn't want to do was get accused of being on one team, so I have not signed up as an expert witness for anybody. And then I've tried to limit the number of grants I write so that I'm not trying to fundraise my research.
So down the road, we can hold you to that you're not going to be working for the Sierra Club and not be a witness?
I do not plan on making any money as a witness for this.
Okay.
I don't know in terms of legal things if I can get subpoenaed or not. I don't know those issues.
Okay.
But
That was just...
I've not signed up with anybody.
I'd had that question presented to me that you were working with the Sierra Club, and I just want to clarify for the committee that if you had a bias there or not. Also,
on that, the Sierra Club has asked me to give talks to explain the science very similar to the way you guys have, and as part of an extension duty of the university, I go out and give those talks. So I've talked at Sierra Club functions, but I've mentioned I'm trying to be neutral in this, and that's my role.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from our committee members? Seeing none, Professor, we appreciate very much your contribution today. I would ask if there's any statement from any member of the audience with some kind of expertise in this area, anyone who would like to speak or address the committee on what has just been discussed. You're now welcome to make a statement if you wish. Seeing none, we will continue. Representative Morissette, you're recognized for your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first speaker today has arrived. Cassie Harnack from the Ponca Nation has arrived. Would you like to make a statement? She was to be my first presenter, but she's now here and she wishes to talk about the true value of water. Do you want to?
Just approach the microphone there at the end of the table and introduce yourself, and we'd be glad to hear from you today. Thank you for being here.
My state Ponca City, Oklahoma, Nudahanga, Ponca Palata, Ponca Council. My name is Yuthi. My Ponca name is. My English name or my school name is Casey Camp Hornick. I'm a member of the Ponca Business Committee on the council up there. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, an aunt, a sister, a companion of 47 years, and I'm a water protector by birth and by heritage. And I came here today, thank you, Mr. Morissette, for inviting me. Thank you, committee, for listening. And thank all of you for being here that are concerned about what's going on here in Oklahoma. I'm one of 39 federally recognized governments here in Oklahoma that are of the Native nations. We have some very real concerns within the Ponca Nation about what's going on with the earthquakes up there. Mr. McBride, I just passed you a note telling you to please mention the infrastructure of the pipelines. Yesterday there was a massive rupture near Cushing, Oklahoma, where the pipeline center is. We live where a pipeline center is with ConocoPhillips Refinery, ConocoPhillips, various other tank batteries and things that are there. We live in constant fear of having an earthquake create a rupture in our area with no emergency plans that include the Native nations here. When I look around this room, I do not see me reflected in the quorum here, or in the committee, or in the audience. So I'm coming here to speak on behalf of those with no voices, those in the Native nations, those that are called animals that have 4 legs, the deer, the fish that swim in those waters. We've had 5 fish kills in the last 2 years in the Ponca Nation, in the Salt Fork River. Yesterday I found out from the DEQ that across the river in Osage country, fracking and injection wells had caused another fish kill there. Our children swim in there. We fish in that water. And to come here and tell you the true value of water is just to ask you what you did when you woke up this morning. Did you reach for a can of oil and take a slug from that? Or did this that we call a sacred form of life, that is part of your life, that is part of the agriculture of Oklahoma, that is part of the future generations that will be able to exist on earth if we care for it, sustain you for this day? It did for me. It did for my children and grandchildren in my nation. And you are human beings as well. So I come here to speak on behalf of the water. My son Mikasi, my son Jeff, my nephew Tesamali, my grandson Wajinguda. My other relatives are at Standing Rock right now, so I came to speak for them as well. Up there, they're taking care of the Missouri River, or Nishude, where the Poncas originally came from. And that water up there that is trying to stop another pipeline from coming through that could corrupt the water itself is necessary for 18 million people downstream. And that includes not just the Native nations, that includes the farmers and the ranchers that feed us every day. That includes all of the people all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. We live in a situation in Ponca Nation where our very water infrastructure is totally, absolutely damaged. We're having to go for an emergency grant to redo the water system because the earthquakes underneath us have created a situation where our well water is poisoned, where the pipes have been so shook up that they're bursting and breaking about every 3 or 4 days because the infrastructure is old there. The water itself is endangered in the creeks and the rivers there from what's going on with these injection wells. We had earthworks come in and did an infrared camera work up there and found that 30 out of 30 of those injection well sites are leaking methane gas. We know that they're not built to withstand earthquakes. So that too is leaking into the air quality as well as the water quality. We know that when that 400,000 per day gallon pipeline in Cushing broke, that we can expect the same thing in Ponca City. the same thing underneath Oklahoma City, possibly. We don't know, because the infrastructures of the pipelines are somewhere between 2 years and 75 years old. That goes into our groundwater. As I was listening to this gentleman speak about the earthquake situation here, we up there are having to provide water, bottled water, to our citizens of our nations because of the bubbling up of the methane gas in the wells. We've had to shut down all the wells on the east side of our reservation, on the south side, and in the center, and depend on water from the city of Ponca City, which costs us $100,000 a year to provide for our citizens. So when we come here to talk about the true value of water, we're talking about ongoing life on earth. We know that the people in the oil industry need to be cared for. We have citizens that work for them too. We're asking them and you and the committee and everyone listening to consider the thought of just transitions, where the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, who some have a vested interest in a monetary interest in some of the injection well sites in our area, start paying attention to how we can transition into renewable energies, how we can save the water for the generations to come. I come here as a water protector. I come here as a great-grandmother. I'm asking for this sacred water, this system of life, to be honored. Wave the hand.
Would you be willing to respond to questions?
I love questions.
Do we have any questions from members of the committee? Representative Morset.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the tribes, the Bureau of Indian, I'm just asking, I don't know the answer to this, just throwing it out there. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency, have they weighed in on any of this, since some of this is on tribal lands and it's a federal issue as well?
There has to be a preponderance of scientific evidence. It takes a period of time to gather up for anything to happen. And recently, as 2 years ago, the Pawnee Nation passed a ban on fracking and injection wells in their area. The Poncas did so recently in February in an attempt to protect the sacred water and the lives of all things. What we have found is that by even passing out this information to everybody with initials, and I'll just be silly here, the EPA, the DEQ, the BIA, the OCC, and everyone else that we could think of, that there becomes this issue of how are you going to prove it? So we have the cracks in the wall. The epicenter of the 5.8 was 10 miles away from my home. So we're very aware of all these things, but to get the proof to happen, the EPA is coming up to the Ponca Nation sometime at the end of this month or the beginning of November to do an assessment. That's been going on for 25 years. DEQ came through and did an assessment of the fish kills, but they only go after certain things, organic things, algae blooms, for instance, to see why the fish are killed. They don't always have the ability to prove, say there's a massive rain, which there was after the last fish kill, that moves everything downstream. So you don't have that immediate proof of the fracking and injection wells creating these situations. And that creates a stalemate for us.
Any other questions from members of the committee? If not, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. And are there any statements that anyone in the audience would like to make concerning this particular part of the interim study today? Seeing none, Representative Morset, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to remind the committee, the first section I had was the science of injection seismicity, which Professor Allen presented to us. My next section talks about an issue we've been talking about, at least I've been talking about for some time, is evaporation and crystallization. These jars that you see on your desk. An environmentally responsible alternative to deep well injections. I have with me today, what I consider now a friend, Brian Call, president of Fairmont Brine Processing. Brian, you got the microphone. You have a video?
Yeah, we can
All right.
hold off on that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you all for taking the time to come out today. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I was all set to launch into what Fairmont brine processing is doing in the Appalachian Basin, but I think it's probably important to get a better understanding of what the current options are for the management of the wastewater that's being produced. So first and foremost, we have deep well injection, which I think we've just learned from Dr. Hallahan that is without a doubt causing the induced seismicity, along with the gentleman that drove me from the airport to here also told me that. So that's first and foremost for how the water is dealt with from this process. Secondly, we can recycle for reuse. I think recycling for reuse is a fantastic option. It's something that is being done all around the country. Recycle for reuse companies are generally a dime a dozen. Anyone in this room could start up a recycling for reuse company. It's a service that we offer in the Appalachian Basin. When you are recycling for reuse, you are essentially creating a Ponzi scheme. At some point, you are not going to be completing wells, and the need for that water will not be there anymore. So to recycle for reuse, to simply clean that water to a level sufficient to reuse in hydraulic fracturing operations is something that's being done all around the country. Nothing new there. It's just not something to count on as an alternative to deep well injection. After recycle for reuse, I would say that people are familiar with evaporation. I had to stop referring to our evaporation and crystallization process as an evaporative process, because what I came to understand is that many think of evaporation as just simply putting this wastewater into pits, impoundments, lagoons, ponds, and simply letting it evaporate naturally. The volume of this wastewater is far too great to just be sitting around in ponds, et cetera, and naturally evaporating, so I don't think that's a feasible option. Thirdly, there are a whole slew of companies doing mobile evaporation. Our company actually has a mobile evap process. We don't utilize it. We don't feel like it's economical. It's important to understand that with mobile evaporation, you are simply you're slightly reducing the volume of that wastewater. You are still left with a large portion of liquid that still needs to be deep injected into the formation. In addition to that liquid that still needs to be injected into the formation, you're left with what you might call a goopy white mess that would then have to be landfilled. There is RO, reverse osmosis. RO has its application. Typically wouldn't be in this part of the formation only because of the high salinity. RO is typically good to up to maybe 75,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids, whereas the salinity of the produced water in Oklahoma can be all the way up to 250,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So those are your most common ways to manage the wastewater produced in the natural resource extraction process. That leaves what we believe is an actual legitimate alternative to deep well injection, and that's a multiple effect crystallization process. We are operating this process in the Appalachian Basin. We are receiving flowback and produced fluid very similar to what's produced here in Oklahoma. However, the salinity is much higher there. We are able to produce 2 ASTM grade salts. We're the only company in the world, and I know this sounds funny, but we're the only company in the world that has ever taken the wastewater produced in the natural resource extraction process and produced 2 ASTM grade salts. It's what's in that jar on everyone's table here. That's just a pure sodium chloride. It's probably a little caked up now. We don't use an anti-caking agent. That is very close to food grade right there. It's used for the de-icing of roads. It's used for pool salt. It's used for water softener. It's even used for animal feed. Every last ounce of that salt that we've made in the Appalachian Basin has been sold for reuse. We've never landfilled one bit of that salt. I'd like to take a minute to play this video here. This is just a depiction of the process of the video we've put together.
you now have an environmentally friendly alternative for the management of flowback and produced water from regional shale gas plays. Introducing Fairmont Brine Processing. We provide solutions to the producing community as well as being an employer of choice in the Fairmont area. We seek to partner and build relationships with our customers, providing a safe alternative to disposal of frack water produced from the Marcellus and Utica shale plays. In fact, the Fairmont Brine Processing Facility is the only fully permitted evaporation crystallization solution for flowback and produced water in the tri-state area. The history of frack water. The Marcellus Shale Formation is deep below the Earth's surface and is accessed by drilling vertically as deep as 10,000 feet, then horizontally in multiple directions. During the drilling process, millions of gallons of water are forced at high pressure into a newly drilled well. While in the well, the water absorbs salts and minerals that are naturally occurring in the Earth's core. This frack water, or brine, is often reused for drilling multiple wells until the salt and other dissolved minerals, collectively referred to as total dissolved solids, reach a level that makes recycling the water no longer practical. When this occurs, drillers must dispose of the frack water. How is frack water treated? In the past, frack water was dumped in streams, rivers, and water bodies, processed in municipal wastewater treatment plants, or injected deep underground in engineered water wells. Currently, frack water producers within Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia have only two choices for disposing of their frack waters. One, deliver their brine to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia for deep well injection, or two, deliver their brine to a concentrator that evaporates much of the brine into distilled water, leaving heavily salted brine, which then is deep injected into an underground well. The Fairmont Brine Processing Facility accepts brine and treats it through a series of processes that remove certain unwanted chemicals and results in clean, marketable products. Let's take a quick look at how it's done. The Fairmont Brine Processing Plant consists of three main processing operations: pre-treatment, evaporation, and crystallization. Pre-treatment. After arrival and before unloading at the 8-bay unloading facility, the contents of the trucks are sampled and tested for chemical composition and physical properties. The truck is then unloaded into a large basin. Here, the brine water can be processed to chemically remove barium, strontium, calcium, metals, organics, suspended and gravitationally removed solids. Residual oils and solids are removed next. Finally, the brine water from the pre-treatment process flows into a large retention pond for temporary storage. Evaporation. The brine water is pumped from the retention pond through heat exchangers to preheat the brine water, and then to the de-aerator to release non-condensable gases, oxygen and nitrogen, before the evaporators. In the vapor-liquid separators, or VLS, the brine water is concentrated as distilled water is evaporated out the top of the vessel. The condensed water vapors are free of salt and suitable for reuse or discharge to the river under permit. Crystallization. Salt crystallization occurs in the evaporation vessels as the water is evaporated and the concentration of the remaining brine exceeds the saturation point of the brine water solution. The salt crystals are then pumped to a hydrocyclone to sort the smaller from the larger crystals. While the smaller crystals are returned to the VLS to continue growing, the larger salt crystals are sent to a centrifuge for dewatering and then fed through a rotating dryer before being conveyed to a storage pile to await customer distribution. Products. The potentially marketable products of the crystallization process are distilled water, crystallized salt, and a liquid mixed salt solution consisting mainly of calcium chloride and residual sodium chloride. All are produced in significant volumes. Distilled water can be used by drillers as fresh frac water, or it can be discharged into the local waterways as clean, uncontaminated water. Crystallized sodium chloride is used as a substitute or a supplement to rock salt in treating local roadways, and liquid mixed salt is used in the winter on coal piles to keep them from freezing. Finally, an environmentally friendly, safe option for treating frac water while producing valuable products. Fairmont Brine Processing, your partner in the process.
So in short, we are receiving flowback and produced water. We are running that through a pre-treatment portion of the process to remove heavy metals, ultimately to produce a cleaner feedstock to the crystallization process. From that process, we are producing distilled water. That distilled water often gets reused in hydraulic fracturing operations. It's not reused, that is discharged under a permit issued by the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection as well as the EPA. We produce the dry sodium chloride, as you can see, and we also produce a liquid calcium chloride as well as a dry calcium chloride flake. I noticed the literature on the tables there. There's some misquoting, I guess, maybe from a newspaper article about the price of the process. We are able to offer this for $2 a barrel now. We feel like at $2 a barrel, you're not going to shut the field down. We understand the water cut is different in Oklahoma. We understand where the price of oil is. We do feel like at $2, it's an economic alternative to deep well injection. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer anything.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Colt. Appreciate you being here today. I have a question. First of all, let me make an observation. I've had some friends up in West Virginia serving in the assembly up there, some of our colleagues, and many of them were a little upset at me a few years ago because I was a natural gas producing state and they were a coal producing state. That has changed in the last couple of years. They are now seeing themselves potentially as being a larger natural gas producing state than Oklahoma at some point, and that very well could be the case. So it's interesting how things are evolving. One of the observations, and I guess the question here that I would have, is that in your business, we do have situations, and I don't know how comparable it is to what you're doing in West Virginia, and I know you're doing some things here, but we do have some production areas that produce an enormous amount of water. And I don't know how much of an impact that has on your ultimate price in terms of what it would cost. And I don't know what the routine is, but I would suggest, at least here in Oklahoma, to my knowledge, we have different areas, and we've got some areas here that really produce a lot of water. Does that change the pricing for someone in your business?
It doesn't change. So the water cut is clearly different here in Oklahoma. It's far greater than I think anywhere else in the country, especially in the Mississippi line. But that has to be taken into account for these operators. These CEOs have to put the balance sheet aside and start to look at the environmental impact of what they're doing. This is a legitimate alternative. It does cost a little more. We're aware of that. We currently have hard contracts on all the salts produced from the first facility. Would be 60,000 barrels per day. We have all of the salt, both the sodium and the calcium, already spoken for. So what we're looking for is any operator to just simply say, we'll utilize the facility if it were to be constructed. And the price would not change. It's $2 a barrel. We probably have an opportunity to chip away at that treatment cost. A few ways to do that. One, if the operator could provide acreage so we don't have to buy it. Two, could the operator provide natural gas at wellhead cost or cheaper? That would be probably the easiest way, as that's the plant's biggest expenditure. Three, if the operator could purchase the distilled water from us. We know they're buying fresh water to begin with. That's another way to chip away at that treatment cost. But regardless of the size of the facility, I should mention that the most economical size for a facility is 60,000 barrels per day, and we could do it for $2 a barrel.
Vice Chairman McBride, for a question.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions that were given to me by the oil and gas community here. And you've answered some of them already, and this is impressive what y'all are doing. But is your process eliminating all disposal volumes?
Correct. So that's one thing I should have been more clear with, and that's something that differentiates what we do with a mobile evaporator. If you remember, I said that the mobile evaporation process still leaves you with a liquid portion that needs to be deep injected. With our process, there is nothing that needs to be deep injected.
Okay. Follow up.
Follow up?
If so, what will you do with the salt and the waste streams and the mislime where the water is 20% salt and waste?
You'd have to be more specific when you say waste. If you're saying that salt is a waste stream, I would disagree with you. We have contracts in place for every ounce of sodium chloride as well as calcium chloride that's from that water.
Okay. And then the last question I have here, you've already answered that. So, that's all I have.
Representative Johnson, do you have a question?
Just a couple of them, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The cost of the plant, you said that the ideal size was?
60,000 barrels per day.
And the cost of the plant to build that?
So I should point that out too. 60,000 barrels per day is going to be around $175 million. We do not expect any funding from the state, oil and gas companies, most importantly from the community. We are prepared to construct this facility on our own with our own funding.
Well, that was my follow-up question. Are you using any public dollars, tax dollars, tax credits, anything whatsoever to build these plants?
No.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Hardin, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you take possession of this produced water, are you assuming full liability for that water? No.
Follow up?
Thank you, sir. In your process, how much carbon dioxide is produced in the process of this?
The CO2 that's produced is covered under an air permit. It would depend on how many boilers we would need for that size facility, but certainly we wouldn't be doing anything that wasn't permissible by the air permit that's required for this facility. My guess here in Oklahoma, the DEQ would be issuing that.
Representative Calvi, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too am very interested in the recycling process on this. Now, and you probably did go over it, but I missed it if so. Other than the things which actually have value, this sodium chloride and calcium chloride that you mentioned, things that generally are waste after that, what do you do with that?
So there is going to be a material that is produced from this process. That is the heavy metals that will be precipitated out during pretreatment. If you do not precipitate out those heavy metals during pretreatment, it will end up in the distilled water or the sodium chloride, and in order for those products to be reusable, you cannot have them in there. So it's imperative that you knock out any and all heavy metals in your pretreatment process. That is going to form a sludge, if you will, and that sludge would be disposed of in a properly permitted landfill.
Okay.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And are you familiar with an investigation in Kentucky about some radioactive sludge that was put in some landfills there?
I am. So in that particular instance, the sludge that had radioactivity, it did go to a landfill. Unfortunately, the contractor that was selected to handle that waste did not do what they were supposed to do. In this particular instance, they were supposed to downblend and solidify that material, which would have made that a non-hazardous material for one, and two, under the threshold of 5 picocuries per gram for that particular landfill. Unfortunately, the contractor did not do that. So how do we ensure that something like this doesn't happen next time? Well, we just put the proper measures in and ensure that it doesn't happen. So maybe we hold the contractor's hand, or we take it upon ourselves to do it right there at the facility. The level of naturally occurring radioactive material is different in Oklahoma as opposed to it is in Appalachia, and I don't think that issue would be relevant here in Oklahoma.
Follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And your company is not part of that investigation?
Our
right?
company was a part of that investigation.
Oh, okay. Was there a result from it?
There were no criminal charges filed. Again, the contractor that was selected just simply didn't do what they were supposed to do. Fortunately, the material had such low levels of radioactivity that every single company or regulatory body involved is on record saying that there is no level of radioactivity to be found, whether it's at the landfill, the school, or any of the surrounding bodies of water.
Okay.
Follow-up.
There was some discussion last year in the recycling about who owns the wastewater when you take it to a recycling facility, and if a producer does a producer own it? Does the royalty owner or the landowner own part of that? Have you explored that issue at all? Because there's some discussion about things like skim oil or iodine, and I presume now if salt is a valuable mineral, that might enter into those discussions.
Sure. In all the agreements that we've structured to date for the facility operating in West Virginia, we have put into the agreement that we accept full responsibility of that water once it arrives at our facility.
Okay.
Follow-up.
Thank you. Last one. If you accept full responsibility for the liability, I get that. I'm talking about if you were going to, mentioned you had contracts for the sale of the sodium chloride and things like that that's produced from it. Who's entitled to the money from that? Is it entirely your company, or would it be the royalty owner, landowner, the producer?
Well, we
who
could
is?
get creative and work something out, but in order to charge only $2 a barrel for a process like this, and you'd find that no one else in the world could get down to $2, you have to rely on the revenue from both salts. So we could get creative and discuss who gets the revenue from it, but ultimately it is our company that would get the revenue from the salt sold.
Vice Chairman McBride, do you have a question?
Yes. So in the Appalachian region, you don't have near the produced water we have in northern Oklahoma. So if you came and put in something in northern Oklahoma, do you feel confident that you could market whatever the byproducts are of this and dispose of it, get rid of it, whatever we're doing with it, since you've got such a larger volume?
So for the first facility, which is, we anticipate 60,000 barrels per day, that's the design. We know the exact volumes of all the products, and we have all those products spoken for under contract already. And quite frankly, that shouldn't be on the minds of an operator for whether or not they would utilize that facility. That's clearly on the business owner. In this particular instance, we are prepared to sell all of the products that we produce from this process.
Follow-up.
So this is a business decision. This isn't, we're not going to clean up all of the produced water that you have. We're going to clean it, but you're only going to clean up what you have contracts for the byproducts of this produced water. If you don't have a contract a year out for these salts, you're going to probably shut down because it's not profitable.
It sounds like we might be finding a reason not to do a facility like this. I mean, the process works. We have hard contracts on these salts for the life of these plants. We have the ability to affect the market, the salt market, throughout this country. I mean, those are the volumes of salt we're talking about. We have the ability to produce those cheaper than anyone else in the world.
I think you misunderstood me. I'm totally for your deal. I'm just looking at it as, sometimes you get sold a bill of goods and
Sure.
you build this and get all this going, and then down the road, well, it's, we don't have contracts for that, so we're going to shut down.
If that was a prerequisite from the state of Oklahoma, if the state of Oklahoma were to say, and I don't know why the state of Oklahoma would allow or not allow this process to go in. I mean, that's through the EPA and DEQ, and an operator obviously has to utilize the process. But if that was a prerequisite, well, we would certainly just show that and say, hey, here's the contracts on these salt for the next 20 years.
Okay.
Any other questions from members of the committee? Representative Morset.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several, Mr. Chairman, so bear with me. Mr. Call, I was concerned about your figure of 60,000 gallons a day.
60,000 barrels.
60,000 barrels, which is equivalent to 2 million.
Someone can do the math on that with a calculator.
It's in the millions, right?
I'm used to barrels. It's in the millions, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Very good. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I continue?
Follow up.
In one of your statements, you and I discussed this earlier, you've had ongoing discussions, apparently. I'm going to mention the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association because it's in one of the press releases. What we'd like to know, what I'd like to know, what the committee would probably like to know, is where are we with discussions of the reality of actually building one of these plants in Oklahoma in the near future?
Well, the reality is we're prepared to start today. We can't build a $175 million facility on speculation. We are aware that this process costs more than it costs to deep well inject fluid. We understand the water cut is different here. We get all of that. I can tell you that these operators are not going to do anything other than deep well inject until they're forced to. I'm not going to tell you who said that, but that is the bottom line. That's the harsh reality. They're not going to make a change until they're forced to, and you can see why. As far as IOGA and the OCC, I hate to say it, but it's a dog and pony show. Most of the people are very competent in their respective fields. However, when it comes to water management and understanding a process like this, they're not competent to vet these processes out. And from my experience over these past 3 years, it's been a dog and pony show.
Follow up. Chairman, when you say forced to, now we're talking about forced to, and I'm going to use my own words, not your words, Mr. Chairman, if I may. That would include rulings from either the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, or a state agency such as the Corporation Commission. Let me make it clear. It's your opinion that none of this will happen with recycling unless they are forced to, i.e. meaning government or court intervention.
Correct.
Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely correct. There's just no reason to. There's no reason to change.
Further, Mr. Chairman, on a different subject.
Follow up.
In Oklahoma, we have what I consider already, and I'm going to the concept of P3s, the idea of public-private partnerships to create environmentally friendly, attractive, for example, members of the committee, the Grand River Dam Authority is something that comes to mind. In my opinion, is in the model of a P3, where there would be a public-private, you've heard my opening statements about public-private partnerships to build either a facility as a P3 or more than one in order to essentially remove saltwater injection wells as a process of searching for commodities. Is that something that has ever been discussed with you as far as the industry here in Oklahoma?
No, it hasn't. And that would be one way. I should take back what I said. It's never going to happen. I mean, that would be one way where I could foresee them making a change. But unless you could compete with the current all-in cost per barrel, and in the slide, I think we saw 50 cents a barrel, so it's anywhere between 25 cents and $2 all-in per barrel. That includes transportation and absolute disposal. If you can't compete with that, then there's no reason to make a change, period.
Finally, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Thank you. Now, in all fairness to the industry, you can't blame them. If the world market of let's say oil is at, let's say, an arbitrary figure of $45 a barrel, and their cost gets their sale price on the open market at 47, they're at an economic disadvantage. So in many respects, the industry is forced by world commodity market effects. But at the same time, with a P3, for example, going to the point that I made in my opening remarks, if we had, if I may, Mr. Chairman, something theoretically called the Sovereign Wealth Trust Fund, where a slight increase in the automotive truck and gasoline fund were increased, let's say 3 cents a gallon at the state level, use those funds to create a P3 in order so that the economic impact to maybe the commodities producers and the public would be limited. Is that an idea that's been expressed anywhere else in the country or something that you've thought about?
No, it's never been brought up from any of the EMPs that I've spoken with in the state of Oklahoma. Obviously, it makes sense. You have to figure out how to offset this cost, this burden to their balance sheet. But it's no different than the steel industry in the 70s. I mean, I came out here from Pittsburgh today. It's no different.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we dumped the water in the, not we, obviously I wasn't doing that, but water was dumped into the river. That was the norm. And regulators stepped in and said, you can't do that anymore. And the steel industry said, well, we can't afford it. And we don't dump the water in the river anymore.
But if I may, Mr. Chairman, look what's happened to the steel industry. We can't have that happen in Oklahoma.
A little bit different. You know, that's more of an issue, I believe, of product being available elsewhere at a cheaper price. I think a little bit different, but.
Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, Mr. Colt, we appreciate you being here today from West Virginia. We do look forward to West Virginia becoming a natural gas producing state. Thank you for being here. Is there anyone here who would like to make a statement? Yes, we have a statement to be made. Would you would you introduce yourself and go from there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Arnella Kargas. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association. You've heard mentioned the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association. To let you know, we are a smaller association than OIPA, but our members are actually the largest companies operating in Oklahoma in the upstream, midstream, and downstream sectors. There are several points brought up in the last presentation that I wanted to address. First off, that Oklahoma oil and gas companies will not stop disposing until forced to. I would take issue with that, in that some of you legislators were invited and some were able to attend a tour of recycling facilities owned by oil and gas companies in Oklahoma. There are more than one location like that, and where we're already recycling produced water today where it is feasible. And when we talk about feasibility, that is not just talking about cost. So you heard some of the issues with volume and salt. In the Mississippi Lime Formation, this is different than any other geologic formation in North America as it relates to oil and gas production. The amount of produced water that comes out of the Mississippi Lime Formation, per every 1 barrel of oil, you can have as much as 50 to 100 barrels of produced water. So that is why we are dealing with an immense volume of produced water with production that comes out of this northwest, north central part of Oklahoma. Other parts of the state where we have oil and gas production does not have the volumes of produced water that accompany that oil and gas production. The other thing about the produced water in the Mississippi Lime is the salt content. It is 6 to 7 times saltier than seawater. So think about that. It is 6 to 7 times saltier than seawater, and we're not recycling seawater for uses today. Think about the difficulties we face in trying to recycle this to a usable level, even for reuse in oil and gas production, which is like the lowest quality. We were looking at various qualities of water for irrigation, agriculture, drinking water, reuse for industrial purposes like oil and gas production. That's the lowest quality of water you can have and use it for that purpose. So it was mentioned even how, in terms of upsetting the salt markets, we've actually had salt companies, publicly traded companies on the salt market, contact us concerned about if Oklahoma were able to find a way to recycle every bit of water that's produced out of the Mississippi Lime, what that would do to the international salt markets. Not to say that should be a hindrance, but this is the volumes of material we're talking about when we talk about the produced water itself and the materials that come with it. Some questions were raised about disposal of the waste. In the Mississippi Lime, besides salts, it's been mentioned there are naturally occurring metals as well as naturally occurring radioactive waste. So it is something that has to be disposed of in a responsible manner. So we have to be thoughtful about how we would dispose of those wastes if we are able to find a recycling process that can handle the volumes of water in the Mississippi Lime. Fairmont Brine has talked about and has really reduced their cost for something that could handle 60,000 barrels a day, which could certainly work on a very small scale. In the Mississippi Lime Formation, operators are still disposing of nearly 1 million barrels a day. So this is the type of volumes that we're talking about. And when we're talking about disposal of produced water, the reason we've been doing it this way is because the EPA has said this is the safest way to dispose of this material that is otherwise hazardous and you wouldn't want on the surface. So I think you have some other presenters later that can talk, more to the science of disposal and how that, is causing issues in Oklahoma. But I just kind of wanted to, simplify kind of the sheer volume and amount of waste we're talking about when we're talking about this one particular formation in Oklahoma.
Thank you very much. Are you willing to take questions?
Sure.
Are there any questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, I will now take a 10-minute break, and we will have roughly about an hour left. So a 10-minute break, and when I say 10, I mean 10, not 11. It's time for us to get started again. Is Representative Morissette? Here he comes, right here. Representative Morissette, you are recognized to introduce your next witnesses.
Okay, thank you. All right, I know we only have about an hour left, gentlemen and ladies, so I'm one to talk, but we need to move this along. I have with me, is it Jared?
Yes.
Okay, this section is section 3. I've entitled this, Mr. Chairman and the members of the committee, Recycling and the Reuse of Oil Field Wastewater, a Win-Win for Oklahoma, including case studies. I have with me Mr. Jared, how do you pronounce your last name?
Bays.
Bays? Mm-hmm. He's the owner of Pure Water Services. You've got the floor.
Well, thank you. As you said, my name is Jared Bays with Pure Water Services, and first I want to thank Representative Richard Morissette and the staff for the opportunity to speak today. And I also want to thank the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and the media and the public that's also in attendance. Pure Water Services is based right here in Oklahoma, founded on the purpose of stewarding the entire life cycle of water by providing innovative, sustainable solutions for managing our water resources within the oil field and agriculture industries. We draw on our background and experiences within the oil and gas industry, agriculture, as well as other industries in order to provide progressive methods for source-to-disposal water solutions, which will complement drilling, completion, and production operations. We provide the choice of clean brine and/or distilled water to meet drilling, fracking, and operational needs, and then complete our services by providing an alternative to traditional saltwater disposal, as we are able to recycle produced water in large volumes to distilled water, which we return back to the ecosystem. Our treatment facilities can be portable or permanent, depending upon our clients' needs. We are proud to have partnered with Fountain Quail Water Management in providing our treatment services. We've gathered a few statistics that we'd like to share to tell the story of general water use and produced water here in Oklahoma. According to the Water for 2060 initiative, which was developed from the Oklahoma Comprehensive Water Plan, the demand growth for water in Oklahoma between now and 2060 is 33%. The purpose of the initiative is for Oklahoma to not use any more water in the year 2060 than what we used in 2012. In fact, Mr. J.D. Strong, Executive Director of the OWRB, recently quoted Governor Mary Fallin in his Water for 2060 presentation at the 2016 Governor's Water Conference as saying, and I quote, "Oklahoma is truly unique in setting such an ambitious goal for water efficiency, conservation, recycling, and reuse. There is no doubt that it will take each and every one of us working together to become the nation's most water-efficient state," end quote. As Governor Fallin stated, it will require the efforts of all citizens who live, work, and play in Oklahoma in order to reach this goal. As we all know, saltwater disposal is an integral part and necessary part of the oil and gas production here in Oklahoma. According to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission records, as of June 2016, there are 341 commercial saltwater disposal wells, 4,066 non-commercial saltwater disposal wells, and 6,831 injection wells in Oklahoma. This means there are 4,407 wells utilized for the disposal of produced water from oil and gas operations, and 6,831 wells used either in the aid of increasing oil and gas production through enhanced recovery methods such as water floods, or simply injecting to various formations. For the purposes of this presentation, we will combine the volumes associated with the three types of wells to provide an overall representation of the produced water volumes disposed and injected here in Oklahoma. And so that's the slide you see there. Data is not yet available for 2015 and 2016 from the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. Therefore, the statistical volumes presented there are the volumes for the year 2014 only. There was 185 million barrels of produced water disposed in commercial disposal wells, 1.4 billion disposed in non-commercial disposal wells, and just over 1 billion barrels injected or disposed in injection wells. This brings the total barrels of produced water put back in the earth under Oklahoma in 2014 to 2.6 billion barrels. This is equivalent of 110 billion gallons. When taking out injection wells and focusing primarily on commercial and non-commercial disposal wells, the total disposed was 1.5 billion barrels. So as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of produced water the oil and gas industry as a whole must steward. Our proposed treatment operations provide a multitude of opportunities for reuse of this produced water, which prior to now has been injected deep in the earth, never to be seen again. So I will now turn it over to Mr. Brent Halderson with Fountain Quail Water Management.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Brent Halderson. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with Fountain Quail Water Management, and I'm also the Chairman of the Texas Water Recycling Association. Please don't hold that against me. You can probably, I don't sound like a Texan, right? I'm actually a Canadian living in Texas, so talk about a conundrum. But I've been doing this for a long time, and I really enjoyed the back and forth and the discussion because we've been struggling with some of these same issues in Texas. So I look forward to telling you some of what we've learned in Texas because we have to be proactive, we have to look for solutions. So today I'm going to introduce Fountain Quail. I'm the case study part of the presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and the future of water recycling, where I think it's going, show you a few case studies, and then wrap it up and hand it back to Jared so that we can take some questions. So a little bit about Fountain Quail. We were the first commercial water recyclers in the first shale play, which was the Barnett Shale, if you remember way back in the day. And you know, it's really an exciting thing to be a part of the shale revolution because it really started with Texas and Oklahoma producers, really. George Mitchell, Mitchell Energy became Devon Energy. So it was really a David and Goliath success story. It was not the big multinationals that discovered unconventionals. It was the small mom and pop producers right here, primarily in Oklahoma and Texas. But water is a big issue, as we've all been talking about. So we were the very first ones to go in and get a recycling permit in the state of Texas. We also, our equipment was the first to meet the Pennsylvania discharge criteria in the Marcellus Shale. Back in the 1990s, our parent company had the first evaporator, thermal evaporator in Alberta heavy oil. That's why you've got a Canadian here. We took the technology that we'd worked on in Canada and we brought it down to the Barnett Shale. But what I'm really proud of is that we founded the Texas Water Recycling Association. It's a nonprofit because we recognize that water is a very contentious issue, as we've heard here today. There's multiple stakeholders. People get really emotional when they talk about water. And I think we need to be open and honest, which is why I congratulate you for having a discussion like this. Because as we've heard, there's pros and cons to everything that you do. The best thing that you can do is be open and talk about what the positives are, what the negatives are. Okay. The other thing that Fountain Quail has done is we believe in being proactive and working with the stakeholders. So we teamed up with Oklahoma-based Pure because we want to have Oklahoma people involved at the ground level. Okay. So even though we just came across the Red River, don't hold that against us. We have Oklahoma-based representation, and we want to work with the local stakeholders. I really object to forcing producers to do anything. I think that's the wrong approach. We need to use the carrot, not the stick. And the producers have been very good. We've come an awful long ways. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Okay. Oh, one brief slide here on the Texas Water Recycling Association. You know, again, we are in the middle of this discussion, kind of the way you are as regulators and legislators. You get caught in the crossfire, okay? And we recognize that water is a very contentious issue. Water is a precious resource. And really what our goal is to remove roadblocks. So Jared told you about the numbers. When you look at the sheer volume of water that is being generated as a byproduct by the oil and gas industry, to say we're going to just switch and go to recycling 100% is naive. The numbers are too big. So we have to take a measured approach and start increasing the amount of reuse and recycle that we're doing. Easiest way to do that is to remove red tape, remove barriers. I don't believe in trying to force people to do it. I say let's try to remove as many barriers as we can to encourage good stewardship. Okay? So we like to present at Austin. We've gone up to Washington even to kind of highlight to people what is and can be done with water stewardship. So in the past, if you think about conventional oil and gas development, in the old days, we'll talk pre-shale, you would drill an oil or gas well, get after the resource would pay for your investment, and then the water would come over time and would be a back-end problem. So water was traditionally viewed by the oil and gas industry as an afterthought. And I don't mean that in a negative way, it's natural if you think about it, because it was a back-end problem. You drill for the resource, the water comes over time, you deal with it at the back. Hydraulic fracturing, these long lateral unconventional wells have changed that dynamic on its head. Now you need the water before you can unlock the resource. Okay? There's also, back in the early days, there was a lot of discussion about what level of treatment, if any, is needed. Again, I take issue with reuse being a Ponzi scheme because to me, any water that you reuse from the oil industry is water that you did not need to source from the agricultural or potable industry. So it is true, though, that you need to be drilling and fracking to be able to make use of that wastewater, right? But we've been figuring that out. Unfortunately, back in the early days, because there was no real spec for treatment, there was a lot of black boxes and snake oil salesmen in the early days, right? You come to today, and what I'm going to show you is we're finding some very unique ways to combine recycling and disposal. Often the best way, if you want to start recycling, you're already aggregating this water to an injection well. That's a natural place to recycle because you paid for the infrastructure to bring it to a central location. The oil and gas producers have also learned a lot about these formations and have developed treatment specifications. So now there's a yardstick for what level of treatment is needed. So when you have a yardstick, those black box snake oil salesmen go away because they can't meet the water treatment specification. And the other thing that I'm really excited about that we're seeing today is significant water infrastructure planning. Okay? When you're building oil and gas pipelines, you know how much oil and gas you plan to move. Water, you think of these shales, it's an intense one-time use of water, so it's really hard to justify putting in a lot of infrastructure. But if you're going into a play and you know that you plan to drill hundreds of wells, the producers are getting proactive now and they're putting pipelines throughout the play to move water back and forth, which I think is a very encouraging development. Okay. So now going forward into the future where I see water recycling going, it's water management is becoming a part of the day-to-day business of oil and gas development. So the old attitudes really have gone, you gotta give the producers a lot of credit. They have come a long ways in a relatively short period of time. They understand how critical the water is in these unconventional plays. Okay? So now they're being proactive about it. And in the future, what I'm looking towards, and the numbers that Jared put up really show you this huge volume of water can become a new resource. We're seeing this in the Permian Basin. If any of you have had the pleasure of going out to Midland, Texas and seeing the lovely Permian Basin, you know that there's not much for scenery out there. Forgive me if you're from Texas, but there's not a lot of surface water, okay? There's not a lot of groundwater, but there's a lot of legacy oil and gas production. And what we're finding is what is going to drive the development of areas like the Permian Basin is this existing volume of produced water that we can repurpose for frack water. So it's kind of exciting that the wastewater that nobody wanted is becoming the key to unlocking a gem of a resource like the Permian Basin. And I think you're going to find the same dynamic come over time in areas like the Scoop Stack in Oklahoma. So a couple of photos to show you what the recycling looks like. This is a clean brine reuse program in New Mexico in the Delaware Basin. And that is snow on the ground. It actually gets quite cold there. It's a little higher altitude than what we're used to in Texas. But these rover units that we have, this is the pretreatment that we developed ahead of our thermal evaporators. It's a chemical clarification system. The idea is we're basically taking out all the dirt, the clay, and the polymer. So you take that dirty wastewater from a well, you take out all the dirt and the clay, and now it's still salt water, but it's clean salt water. And the idea is we put that clean salt water into pits so it can be reused as frack water. The reason to take the solids out, if you look at that pit, that's a brand new pit that our customer built. That's about a 400,000 barrel containment pit. They don't want all that sludge and the solids and the associated issues. So the idea is we take the solids out ahead of the containment, and we treat the water on the fly. The beauty of this is it's very low cost. So the rule of thumb that we tend to use is that to load water on a truck costs about $1 a barrel, just loading and unloading time, just to get water on a truck. So by reusing it in the field like this, as long as you're drilling nearby, we can save about half of that cost. We can get down into the 50, 60 cent a barrel type range. Okay? But again, it does require that you have a need for that water. And in this case, the customer has a fairly large acreage base, so we can take their wastewater, make that their frac supply water. This second case study I wanted to show you, our friends at Devon Energy, a good Oklahoma-based company. This was the Barnett Shale back where we got our start. I really like that photo at the bottom because that's 3 consecutive fracs, and our water recycling system was right in the middle. And that pond that you see in the upper left-hand corner, what Devon did was they built the customer a pond for their racehorses. So you can imagine, talk about being a win-win. You have to work with the energy producer, they have to work with the landowner. We want everybody to be a win-win. In fact, this landowner liked it so much, he built his acreage overlooking his new distilled water pond, if you can see it in the top left corner. And over that period of time, we worked in the Barnett Shale from 2004 until 2013. We recycled over 20 million barrels back to a freshwater standard. And that would have been pure distilled water, less than 100 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. Okay. So in that case, the customer wanted it treated to a freshwater spec, not because they had to have freshwater to frack with, but they liked the idea of storing and moving large volumes of fresh water instead of salt water. All right. There's another photo of the Nomad units. In that background behind the second Nomad, you can see a pit full of, that's pure distilled water. Okay. And again, we worked very actively with the Railroad Commission in Texas, did all the analysis on the water. Over a decade, they had so much confidence in the Nomad thermal process that in the new 2013 Railroad Commission recycle rules, they actually made a special exemption for distilled water from a thermal system like a Nomad. That if it gets used within the oil field, they removed any barriers to reuse. Okay? And again, the Railroad Commission was very careful not to go outside of their jurisdiction. They're over the oil field, so they removed barriers to reusing the water within the oil field. All right? And to give you an idea of how we make it cost effective, what you see on the left is a conventional thermal evaporator. It's a falling film type system. What the Nomad is for the same capacity, it's about a quarter of the size. So even though it's smaller and more efficient, what we like about it is easy to open and clean because this water is so variable. Those of you that are in the industry understand this water changes hour by hour, day by day. The longer it's in contact with the formation, the different salinity it has and the different minerals that are in the water, and then you commingle a bunch of wells together. This is the most variable wastewater in the world, in my opinion. So you need a very rugged, easy to clean solution, and that's what we focused on with the Nomad evaporator. Part of the reason why I wanted to put this in here is it's going to lead into what we plan to do with crystallizers, which is going all the way to a zero liquid discharge. Now the Nomad units are mobile, they're designed for in-field, but that same being compact, efficient, and modular can be applied on a plant scale. This happens to be a design for a 60,000 barrel per day, what we call a modular base plant. Okay.
And we've designed it in such a way that a portion of the equipment can be continuously cleaned while in operation because of the high variability of the wastewater. And that photo at the bottom left is actually a mobile base plant that we built for BP up in Ontario, Canada, back in the late 90s. So now, why the talk about crystallizer? It was mentioned before by an earlier presenter. One of the issues is that in some areas that have very high disposal costs, this water is already extremely salty. So the total dissolved solids is already near saturation, okay? So if you get anywhere above 200,000 milligrams per liter, what that means is you're almost to a point of complete saturation, to where if you wanted to run a thermal evaporator on that, you could do it, but your recovery would be so low, it wouldn't be economically feasible. So if I came to you and said, hey, I can treat 10,000 barrels of your water, but I got to give you back 8,000 for disposal, that doesn't make any economic sense, and we get that. So we agree that a crystallizer is ultimately a very real solution when you can go all the way to salt. Okay. So we are taking our experience with the Nomad. We pioneered thermal evaporators in the oil field. We're now applying that know-how to a crystallizer. But the challenge, as we've heard, is how do you make it cost-effective and practical? Okay. And I'm going to show you some of our ideas that we're very excited about. So what we have done is we have partnered up with a multinational crystallizer company that works in various different industries. And we've taken our oil field know-how and we've teamed up and we're developing a product that we call the XL. And hopefully Bill Gates won't have an issue with that. If he does, I may have to change it. But XL, the real, if you think of the crystallizer as an XLER, so it's a little bit of a play on the term for a crystallizer. Okay? We call it an XL10 because an XL10 can treat 10,000 barrels per day. Now, we had some discussion about the salt, and what you guys did is you zeroed in on kind of the elephant in the room. If you go all the way to salt, you have to manage the salt. And to give you an idea, we took 200,000 milligram per liter TDS water. If we're running 24/7, that generates 160,000 tons per year of salt. Okay? So if you're out in the middle of a rural area of Oklahoma, what on earth are you going to do with 160,000 tons per year of salt? We don't need to de-ice the roads in north central Oklahoma, not very often anyhow. So we need to start looking at, we've got to be realistic at how do we manage the sheer volume. And as has been stated, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the overall volume. So this is a big issue to wrestle with. We've come up with what we think is kind of a unique hybrid approach. So what we want to do in phase one is take the raw, dirty oil field wastewater as is, just as it would come to a disposal well. We want to run it through an XL10 crystallizer and recover the 90+% fresh water that we can get out, get all the fresh water out that we can. And even though you're close to saturation, we're driving it past saturation, we're driving it to a salt slurry. And then we want to take that salt slurry and put that down a disposal well. So instead of jumping right to the beneficial reuse, which is where we think you can ultimately get to in phase two, this has too many moving parts. You're trying to manage salt, you're trying to pre-treat. At the sheer volumes of salt generation that we're talking about, it just becomes almost an incomprehensible task to get going. Because you talk about the capital of building a crystallizer, that's one thing. Well then let's say you've got a chemical plant that wants to build a chlor-alkali plant. That might be a $10 million chlor-alkali plant. How do they justify that expenditure if they don't know yet if you can make salt for them? So we think the best way to approach this is to start simple with a coupling of a crystallizer and a disposal well. The slurry is not a dry salt product. We're basically taking it at its consistency and we're pumping it downhole where it is higher temperature and then it'll go back into solution. So it's not like we're pumping dry salt down a disposal well. We're actually taking it as far as we can and still pumping a liquid slurry downhole. But then once we're doing that and we can prove that we can do it day in, day out and show people, then we can attract the salt market. And what was said before is exactly right. You pre-treat out what you do not want in the salt. So if there are heavy metals or something that you do not want to come out in salt, you simply pre-treat that, but that adds cost and complexity. We feel that it's easier to add that in after in phase 2 and then get whatever level of salt the customer needs. Definitely don't want to over-treat if we've got an industrial user for salt that doesn't need a high purity salt. And the nice thing about being still co-located at a disposal well is you still have the ability, the backstop of being able to put product downhole if needed. So that if your salt containment barn is full, you don't have to shut down, you don't have a bottleneck. You still have the ability to continue to operate. And we think that the future really involves the integration of recycling and disposal. And it really converts a disposal well into more of a water management hub. And a lot of companies that own their own disposal wells, if you think about it from their perspective, they've invested in the gathering infrastructure, the tanks, all of that. By adding recycling in there, you don't have to go and build separate infrastructure. You use the existing infrastructure that's already been paid for, and then you recycle the water out to whatever degree it can be used. So if they're fracking nearby and they can use that really low-cost clean brine, well, then you do that. That's a no-brainer. Do the cheapest thing possible. But over time, as these fields mature, you can add in whatever level of treatment you need and ultimately get to beneficial reuse to where we're net generating water back to the environment. So in summary, I really do believe that U.S. domestic energy development is a tremendous good news story. I mean, we've talked about the jobs and national security, energy independence. Oklahoma gets how critical oil and gas is to your economy. So does Texas. But we can't have our head buried in the sand like the first presenter said. We need to look at these water issues. We need to talk about them. And again, I want to congratulate you for having this hearing, because we got to look at every aspect of this. Really, any resource has environmental impacts. I mean, I drive by the wind turbines. They have environmental impacts. Nuclear have obvious environmental impacts. So yes, unconventional oil and gas do have environmental impacts, but we can greatly reduce what those are simply by removing barricades and giving producers all the options they need without trying to force them to do anything, okay? Because I think the producers are savvy enough to understand the scope of these projects, and they know where these are going, and they know that this is going towards more and more reuse, okay? And one thing, as a Canadian talking to a bunch of Americans, I can tell you, you are the world's innovators, really. If you just say what the challenge is, state it, you can meet it head on. And I think what we need to do with water is really state what the issue is, have forums like this to talk about it, and we're not going to be able to shut disposal off overnight, but I think we can start migrating towards more beneficial reuse with a goal of eventually, as these plays produce, having them largely driven from their own produced water and net generating water back to the environment. So Jared, you've got a few slides to wrap up, I think, and then we'll take questions at the end if that's okay.
Could we move to questions now? We're getting very, very close. We are running out of time. If that's all right, I think we probably may have a question or two. I'm going to limit just one question from each member of the committee on this because we're way behind here. I would like to ask if you can take the water from your treatment plant and put it right into a stream.
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. The water, by virtue of the fact that it's a thermal distillation process, if you think about it, what we're doing is we're taking the wastewater, we're boiling it, creating steam, and condensing that steam. So by virtue of the fact that we're creating a phase change and condensing that steam, we make very pure distilled water. In fact, it's less than 100 milligrams per liter TDS. So we actually have to re-oxygenate it so that we don't cause fish kill because it's too pure. It will actually, but to answer your question, yes, this is extremely clean water by virtue of the fact, and that's why the Railroad Commission made that special exemption for distilled water. Now, if you come along with a thermal or a membrane-based system, for example, they maybe can't make that same claim. So the Railroad Commission was comfortable by Fountain Quail's track record to say, hey, over a decade, you proved it to us. Let's remove the barrier so that we're encouraging people to reuse this water as much as we can.
Okay, try to keep your responses brief as possible. We are running out of time. Representative McBride, you have a question.
So have you ever tried to use any of this water in irrigation, drip or row water type irrigation?
Okay, so I haven't directly, but we have up in Pennsylvania, a company that we work with called Eureka. They discharge to the stream, and then of course the farmers irrigate out of the stream, but we've never direct put it to irrigation. There was a pilot done last year, and I can send you the information if you like. It was direct irrigation on a cotton crop out by Pecos, Texas. So they have done some pilot studies on that. But again, they would probably have to re-oxygenate the water just so that if it came in contact with any animals that there was no adverse effects.
Representative Harden, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You talked about the salt slurry. Would you have to inject that under greater pressures because of it being a slurry instead of the water?
Actually, that's a very good question. We actually think you need less pump horsepower because it's actually denser product. So as it goes down deeper, the temperature is higher, the deeper you go. We think it'll actually take less pressure, but it's something we need to study because it is a more viscous fluid. So I don't have that answer for you yet, but that's a very good question.
Representative Morissette, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, I think it's fate that Mr. Halderson indicating that he's got Canadian ancestry. He doesn't understand either, but I am from French Canada. That's where my ancestors come from. Unfortunately, he settled in Texas, and I settled in beautiful Oklahoma. My question is, you indicated that the carrot and stick for producers, that they're already doing this. One of the individuals from the OIPA industry just indicated to us that they're producing over 1 million barrels a day, and somehow there's no solution to that because there's 1 million barrels a day. In Texas, you don't have earthquakes. We do. You failed to leave that out of your presentation. How do you get the carrot and the stick, when they've been doing this for so long, for essentially 50 cents a barrel, to move them into recycling?
Yeah, I mean, listen, these are difficult questions, sir, and I agree. Now, we have had earthquakes in Texas. We've had the odd one in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but thankfully not as many. But listen, we recognize that it's an issue. My job as a recycler is how do I get cost-effective with disposal? Let's say it's 50 cents a barrel. How do I get my costs down without trying to force people to do it? One thing that we're looking at in Texas, and I really like your idea on the PPP idea. We had not discussed that in Texas, but I think that has merit. We looked at the high-cost gas tax credit that we have in Texas. We said, here's an existing model. Maybe we could take this same tax model and apply it to water recycling and say, if somebody is proactive in water recycling, maybe we'll give them a severance tax credit to help encourage that. So I really think we need to be talking because we've kicked around ideas in Texas, but I would like to open that up and hear some of your ideas because that PPP idea I think is a very valid concept.
In the interest of time, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation. In the interest of time, I do want us to go ahead and proceed. I'm going to ask Representative Morissette if he would introduce the last part of our meeting.
I will. Robert Jackman is here, who I've known. Is it Dr. Jeremy Boak? Is that right? Are you here? Right behind you. All right, there you are. And we have one other gentleman, Mark. How do you pronounce your last name? I want all of you to just kind of congregate that way. We're going to have a question and answer period. Mr. Jackman, I'm going to warn you, you like me are a little long in the tooth when we start talking, so I want you to keep your comments.
Would you say that again, sir?
I will add to that. We do need to move right along, so if you can, make your comments as brief as possible, gentlemen, and we'll try to have a little time in the end
Take
for
about
questions.
a minute to introduce yourselves, or 2 minutes while you're here, and then let's open it up for a frank discussion of this. Please, all three of you.
And introduce yourself. Introduce yourself as you come to the microphone.
Robert, that way. The one that's standing there. Just start it off. Robert, remember, a minute opening statement.
Thank you. Representative Morissette, and Chairman, Vice Chairman, my name is Bob Jackman. I'm a petroleum geologist, former oil and gas operator in Oklahoma, still very active in the business. I'm a practitioner. I'm concerned. The issue here really is we are in a race against a potential disaster. The volumes we have far exceed what we have been talking about. The innovations are very impressive, but our problem is different. While we have been having this meeting, roughly 30 to 50,000 barrels of disposal water has been injected while we're having this meeting. We are injecting somewhere of close to 1 million barrels per year, constantly. The presenters were giving us good solutions, but our problem is right now. Their solutions, frankly, are a Band-Aid while we have a hemorrhage. If we get, and we have ratcheted up, the more we put underground, the more we're getting into the possibility of a disaster. A 6.2, 3, 4, or 5. We have not assessed in this state to date the damages that have occurred. We have an unusual situation here. We have a formation called the Mississippi Line that just pushes out enormous quantities of water. Are we going to return to that? As for the price, here's the thing that scares me. The price of oil runs back up to $60 a barrel. Will we be back drilling horizontals in that formation? Yes, there are companies coming out of bankruptcy right now that have already made plans to do that. So are we going to go through another cycle? There's some ladies here from Medford, Oklahoma, the earthquake capital of the United States. Unless you do something drastic and quick, we could have another cycle where we exceed what we had of 907 M3 pluses last year. The so-called decline that we're having is somewhat welcome, but I'm afraid it may be just a temporary until we run back into it. By the way, I differ with some, is that the bragging on the decline in earthquakes, I attribute this 60% of it to the decline curve in production. It has never been brought up. You get a decline curve in production, most wells after 3 or 4 years, they're only producing about 10% of what they originally did. That means 10% less wastewater. That's what's giving us this slight decline. The other thing that has caused it has been, yes, the markets. The other thing that's caused it has been the number of bankruptcies. So we're facing in a race for a disaster unless we act quickly. I applaud all their programs. But when we're pumping as much as 700 to 1 million barrels per day, these solutions will work in certain areas, but not what we have here. Thank you very much. I'll cut this kind of short. Normally, I would like to talk a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
I'm Jerry Boak. I'm the state geologist of Oklahoma. It's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. I work for the state. The Geological Survey was written into the Constitution of Oklahoma, so we've been around for a long time. I want to say right off that we are not the earthquake capital of the U.S. We're the minor league earthquake capital of the U.S. We have a lot more small earthquakes. California last year had 3 magnitude 5s, and that's a fairly regular phenomenon in California. Whereas here, you've got to go back to 2011, even with this pulse of earthquake activity. In addition, there are 2 plays that are responsible for this. One of them is a frac play, one of them is not. Fracking isn't what's responsible for these earthquakes. Hydraulic fracturing is done in most of the Mississippi Line play wells, but it's not done that frequently in the Hunton, which is actually where this started in Oklahoma and Lincoln counties. It was only later in 2013 and afterwards that the Mississippi Line play really came in and actually may well have dominated it. I think we're actually injecting about 2 million barrels a day at this point in the 685 wells we track that are injecting into the Arbuckle. That's down by more than 1 million barrels a day from late 2014. It's fairly clear that that decline started in part in response to prices, but most of it has been captured by the actions of the Corporation Commission, and I don't think that my colleagues who would like to come and visit us, along with their dogs and ponies, so they can get away from their phones for a day or two, for a period of time, The Corporation Commission is probably not going to let the companies that they have placed directives on go back to producing large amounts of water and injecting it into the Arbuckle, which is the formation of concern. In addition, we were already injecting fairly substantial amounts of water into the Arbuckle back in 1980 when that 1.5 to 2 earthquakes per year number was happening. So it's really about the increase that happened in the last few years driven by these two plays. Those two plays have very high water cuts. On average, I'd say somewhere in the 15 to 20 barrels of water per barrel of oil. If that's going to cost $2 a barrel to process, that's $40 for every barrel of oil you get out, and you've got $10 to do all your operational costs and make a profit. That doesn't look like a great deal. At 50 to 60 cents a barrel, maybe you're getting somewhere in there. But I would point out that at 60,000 barrels a day, we'd need to build 33 of those, and the estimate of the cost would be somewhere in the order of $5.8 billion. I know that we don't have that handy, and I suppose capital markets maybe do, but capital markets have shown some wariness about engaging in the oil and gas industry lately, I think. Let's see, what else there? Oh. Those are the main things I wanted to say. I think actually the salt problem is probably not that critical. It would be on the order of, as I think you said, 160,000 tons of salt. And the one citation I could find is that we put about 1.5 tons. When we salt, we put about 1.5 tons per lane mile down. Other places do a lot more. We could probably use up a fair amount of salt in this state. And I think that overall, nationwide, the industry is big enough to handle that particular problem. But I think the cost is going to be absolutely the essential driver to resolve this. And if reuse of water, and it's not really reuse actually, 95% and more of this water is naturally occurring water being produced during the life of the well. I've had a long-standing argument with the press who wants to call it drilling and fracking waste. That's like calling coal fly ash construction waste from a power plant. This is water that's being produced during the life of the well. It isn't just about fracking. In Pennsylvania, probably most of the water they have to deal with is fracking. In Ohio, in the eastern states, because those gas plays tend to have much lower water cuts. In Texas, there's probably a whole variety. They dispose of a lot more water than we do. But they do it over the whole area of Texas, so they don't have the kind of concentration we do. For those of you who are from out of state, 98% of the earthquakes are happening in about 17% of the area of Oklahoma. It's really concentrated, and that's because the disposal is very concentrated. That's part of what Todd was alluding to, is we've got lots of lakes that went down. The lake mechanism just doesn't work because we had lakes that went down and came back up, and they didn't have any earthquakes. But oddly enough, the lakes that did go down and come up and have earthquakes also happen to be where all the disposal was going on. So we're pretty confident about that mechanism, but we will never have the smoking gun that shows that pressure increase, water pressure driven by injection at the Arbuckle zone is causing earthquakes at 18,000 feet, which is where the average earthquake is happening. We have to do that by inference, by correlation. We won't probably ever have the perfect proof of it. And my favorite candidate for the best proof of it is the fact that it went up, seismicity went up when injection went up, and seismicity is going down as injection is going down. If we want to drive recycling towards lower water cut plays, that may be a useful application, but it isn't the right thing to do necessarily for reducing earthquakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Dershweiler. I'm the Vice Chair of the Sierra Club Oklahoma chapter. Since somebody deemed to call me an expert for this Q&A section, let me just briefly state my qualifications. I am a professional engineer licensed to practice in Oklahoma. My academic background is in civil engineering and regional and city planning. Just last year, after 40 years of public service, I retired from the Department of Environmental Quality, where I was the engineering manager in charge of our water quality planning section. I am a skeptic. I've been called a pessimist. I don't think I go that far, but I am a skeptic.
We've been led to believe in the past that pipelines don't leak. We've been led to believe that oil tanker trains won't derail, and even if they do, they won't break open, but even if they do, they won't catch on fire and explode. We've been led to believe that injection wells don't cause earthquakes, and we know that all these things, today we know that all these things are basically not true. So when I hear people say that we're going to take the contaminated salt water from these wells and run it through a black box and end up with pure salt and uncontaminated distilled water, I'm a skeptic until I see the numbers and the results from the testing. And there weren't any results from the testing here today that we saw. So I think the question is still open on that. We do know that there's a difference between the fracking wastewater and the produced salt water from the wells, and that was kind of commingled together here in some of the presentations. We don't know everything that's in the fracking water because of the restrictions on proprietary information that are claimed, but there are literally hundreds of chemicals, some toxic, some maybe not toxic, that can be included in that. I think it might be wise to at least look at the possibility of segregating that fracking wastewater from the produced water, which may not have all those contaminants in it. But even the produced water, it's not just salt that's in there. That's what a lot of the emphasis here has been on. But there are organic contaminants that can be present. There are metals, as well as radioactive elements. And we certainly don't want to be trading one problem, earthquakes, for another problem or another set of problems that may come down the line through this process. We've heard Representative Calvi this morning talk about or ask about radioactive sludge in Kentucky. The first law of ecology is that nothing goes away. So all of these other things that are included in the salt water, organic contaminants, metals, radioactive substances, radioactive materials, those all go somewhere. And I'd be curious to find out what happens to those, if any of it is volatilized and ends up in the air that may affect people that live next to these facilities. How much of it ends up in the water? The wastewater or the water discharges into the streams in the state. That will not be something that DEQ does. That will be dealt with the U.S. EPA. We don't have the delegation of that part of the wastewater permitting program in Oklahoma. EPA retains that jurisdiction, so these facilities will be dealing with EPA for that. Even salt is not necessarily benign. If you look at the impaired waters listing for Oklahoma, which is a compilation done every 2 years at the DEQ of streams and lakes that don't meet their water quality standards, chlorides, sulfates, and total dissolved solids are 3 of the top 10 pollutants that we have for streams and rivers already in this state. So we need to be very careful about where these places are located and what runs off of the site, what could end up in the stream. And finally, let me just go back to what Representative Morissette mentioned in his opening remarks, the 2 things that he wanted to focus on. First of all, investments in alternative energy, and then reducing the damage from fossil fuels in the meantime. And I would suggest that if we focus our efforts on moving from a fossil fuel-based energy economy to clean renewable sources, that will solve both of those problems for the long term. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Morissette, for organizing this. We appreciate your leadership on this issue. You will be sorely missed, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation made by our panelists. And if you panelists would just be available here, we may have some questions from our committee. I'll ask if any member has a question. Representative Calvi.
Yeah, this would be for Mr. Boak. Mr. Boak, I recall an interim study we had in my committee last year in which I remember your image vividly. You described that at that point the commission was starting to take this action about limiting the amounts of injection water in the place where it appears to have caused the concentration of seismicity. And you also gave us a caution that you said that while putting that weight of water down there can cause seismicity, also just like a spring, like compressing a spring, when you uncompress it, that can cause some of that. So even if we have, I won't say solved the problem, but taken good steps to reduce the likelihood of seismicity with regard to injection wells, even after that point where we're not contributing further, or as much at least, to the problem, there will still be occasionally some seismicity because of the release of that pressure. Is that not correct?
The Earth readjusts slowly and in a kind of haphazard way. One of the things that you see in looking at daily rates of earthquakes, it's all over the map. Even if you do a 30-day running average, you see these pulses of seismicity.
Follow up.
And that's fairly common. But the overall trend is downward, and it's quite a bit downward. It's down, I think now, close to 50%. And actually blipped up in response to the Pawnee earthquake. We did have a lot of related seismicity, but it's back on that downward track that it's been on. And I think that's a fairly clear and consistent trend. It's optimistic. But as we're going along, one of the curious things about the big earthquakes we've had, they've all been at the edges of the area where the earthquakes are happening. A simple-minded geologic explanation is we've got this large body of water in there that is raising pressures, and it doesn't take very much pressure. It's a relatively small quantity of pressure you have to have, because virtually all the faults in the U.S. are very close to critical stress, according to Dr. Mark Zoback of Stanford. He's been saying this for decades, that they're all kind of ready to go. And that's tectonic energy, the broad scale plate tectonic energy is what's being released in these earthquakes. It's not anything to do with the injection. But yeah, there is an adjustment period, and as Todd pointed out, the largest earthquake at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal came a year after they stopped injection. I will say that the injection pressures in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal were thousands of pounds of pressure, whereas most of the Arbuckle injection is not being made under pressure. They're essentially gravity feed. They're pouring it down the well. My hydrogeologist, Kyle, points out that most of the wells he's been sampling lately, when you open them up, they suck. But up to, when they really need to put a lot in, up to a few hundred pounds per square inch, which is moderate, but not the thousands of pounds. I've seen people acting as if you were out there trying to frack these wells, but that would be a very expensive thing to do for a disposal well, and not too helpful.
Any other questions from members of the committee? Representative Morissette, you're recognized.
Chairman Watson, I want to ask a little indulgence here. There are several people from the community that had property damage in Edmond. We have the people from Medford. I'd ask the chairman a little bit of latitude, a couple minutes, if they each want to speak. If not, we have a representative from Edmond that has a few words about the consumer housing damage that's occurred recently in the central Oklahoma area. If that be permitted for a brief or two.
We can do that, but we're not through with this yet. Okay. We want to make sure we have all the questions that members want to ask about this.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question to Mr. Jackman related to what Mr. Boak is saying. I'm not a geologist and I'm not a scientist, and I may be wrong about what I just heard from the Oklahoma Geological Society, but I'm almost hearing some explanations. Almost, there's nothing we can do about this. That's almost what I think I heard. Am I hearing that wrong, or maybe he can explain it better? But, we're injecting this stuff. Well, so what? We have tectonic plates. So what? Is that what I just heard?
Yes and no, and that's a great question. Probably the best one we have heard today. All due respect to the other gentlemen. We have got to stop the earthquakes, and now. We hear that it's all the jujitsu of seismicity and the pressures and so forth, which I understand. And these two gentlemen here are far superior than me, Dr. Todd Hallahan and Jerry Boak, in understanding the mechanics of it. It is very complicated, but we get caught up in that complication, and this is where you're going, and not addressing the problem. How do we stop it right now? Because it is dangerous, it's deadly, and we could have a major disaster here. Yes, put a moratorium. It takes, we have the perfect storm here. We have the Mississippi Formation, which I've drilled in. By the way, I forgot to tell you all, I was a first graduating class of OSU as a geologist. I went to A&M, they changed their name. I'm still very active in the business. Have a large project in Central America right now. The answer that you bring, question that you bring up is, okay, we don't have time for all the excellent programs that have been brought up here to take place. Our problem is right now. We have this perfect storm. We have the Mississippi line that produces 50 barrels or more of wastewater per barrel of oil, huge quantities. We've got oil companies getting ready to start drilling back into that. We have 40 other formations in Oklahoma that produce oil and gas. So we should put, you should put, the government should put a moratorium on Mississippi line production, new drilling in that formation until the other science gets caught up. That's not shutting down the industry. That's not calling on a moratorium on the whole state. That's not calling on a moratorium on there's 3,200 disposal wells. That's shutting down the disposal wells that are causing the earthquakes in the red hot earthquake fairway that we have. There's your answer for right now. And that's when our problem is right now.
Okay, I'm going to ask if there's any statements that might be made from the audience who has on this last section. Yes, if you would go to the microphone, introduce yourself, and proceed.
I'm Bud Ground. I represent Environmental Federation of Oklahoma. And I thought after listening to this, I'm also on the governor's Produced Water Working Group. And so I really want to let you know that what that Produced Water Working Group has been doing this last year, and as the legislators in the room, let you know that there are actually some regulatory and legal issues involved with around some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So we have been meeting and we are collecting data. A lot of the data that someone mentioned, the oil companies thought were proprietary as far as the constituents in the water. We're trying to collect that so that as a state we know where the water that can take the least amount of cleanup to be used in another process for reuse. And we're looking at industrial, agricultural, complete reuse, possibly even put back into a stream, possibly for aquifer recharge, whatever the water could be used for. But there are legal and regulatory issues involved. And one that we tried to work on this last year that did not make it through was who actually owns that water. And that's a huge issue, and until that gets resolved, none of this will happen. The only thing that we can legally do with that water currently is reuse that water for oil production. If you use it for any other reason, then there's a question of ownership. So I want to bring that up as one of the big issues that we have to work on before you can actually recycle that water. I know there is, as Mr. Dershwall mentioned, you can't just put this water back into a stream because it does take permits, and those permits are through EPA, not the state. And EPA told us in our work group that those take an average of 2 years to get a permit to do that. So there are some timeline issues. I just want to bring you up to date on what's happening so you can think about these as we go into this next legislative session.
Are you willing to respond to questions?
Absolutely.
Any questions from members? Seeing none, we will proceed, and Representative Morissette has requested that we have some comments made. What I'm going to do at this point, since we have reached the end of our time, I am going to limit to 2 minutes. All of the different statements that may be made, but we certainly are pleased that you are here. We welcome you here, and we do want to hear from you. You're recognized. If you'll introduce yourself, who you are, we're delighted to hear from you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. My name is Darlene Hitchcock, and I live in Edmond, Oklahoma, which is practically the epicenter of many quakes. I find it very disturbing today to come and listen to questions concerning the cost, because I don't see anywhere in this discussion that my costs are considered as part of the costs of the overall operation. The people in Pawnee, I get up every morning and I turn on to the USGS site. on my computer and I look at the activity that has occurred over the last 24 hours. And then I check periodically for cumulative quake activity. And I know the ladies in Medford, the people from Medford, are going through the same thing. And I don't see a recognition of our dilemma. The entire investment of my life, with the exception of a few dollars, is in my home. And nothing that you are saying is addressing that. There's the environment. Where's the fresh water coming from? We may look as if we're powerless, but I will tell you, we are going to be voting. We're going to be voting in numbers that you have not seen. And I urge you to seriously, seriously consider our needs as well. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone else who would like to address the committee on this issue? Yes, sir. You're, again, please introduce yourself, and we're delighted you're here today.
My name is Mike Hazlip. I live basically at the epicenter of the 5.8. I live northwest of Pawnee, and I'm delighted that you're having this hearing. I'm excited about the possibilities, but my concern, as Mr. Jackman here mentioned, is near term, and it looks like so many of these things are so far in the future for us to get to, and we have a concern about my place is, my barn burned down, my house is ripped apart on almost every wall. This is my retirement, my dream home. All my retirement went into my place, so I understand what this lady is talking about as well, and I'm very encouraged that you're having this hearing. But my concern is, what are we going to do short term? And I'm not against the oil and gas industry. I've been in it for 30 years. My dad was in it, my uncles, my great uncles, my grandpa. So we respect the oil and gas industry, but they need to produce this Mississippi line. If they're going to have the Mississippi line produced, then we've got to deal with the wastewater in a responsible manner. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to the committee? Seeing none, I will ask Representative Morissette if you'd like to wrap up your interim study.
I would like to wrap up. I think this has been, and I think the committee would agree, many times our interim studies are pro forma and we just kind of go through the motions. But by the questions and the activity of the members of the committees that were here, clearly this is an issue that you in the next legislative session, I hope, will take up. Chairman Watson, I hope that you will take a leadership role. I know your abilities. I wish you'd run for speaker. I think you do a great job at that. The way you conducted this meeting, you clearly have management skills. What I would hope, and lastly, before I forget, because I did it the last time, the real energy and expertise and organization into this meeting went to my legislative assistant, Jackie Brink-Rosen. If any of you that are still in the legislature want an organized machine, she's the one to have on your side, believe me. So all of the credit goes to her and not to me. We have disagreements. I can see the disagreement in the room. There are disagreements as to the solutions, but we know there's a problem. And Americans, and especially Oklahomans, through its 108-year history, have always come to the forefront of finding a solution to a problem. Let's have the discussion. Let's have heated discussions, but let's remember the final objective here. We can produce the commodity, but do it in a safe, environmentally manner that'll make this process safer for the years to come. Thank you for having this meeting, Mr. Chairman, and the committee.
And members, before you leave here, I do have something I want to say. We have two members here who will not be with us next year. One is my seatmate, Representative Johnson, who I am going to sorely miss. Representative Johnson was one of those guys, and I'm sure you know that those of us who sit on the floor all day long, sometimes your seatmate has more influence on you than anybody else. And Representative Johnson and I come from different backgrounds. I come from a corporate background. He came from a small business background, was also mayor of Duncan for a while, and was always one, probably had more influence on changing my vote than anybody on the floor of the House. And so, Dennis, love you, buddy, and going to miss you next year. Obviously, Representative Morset is going to be, this is his swan song, and I've served 10 years. I know other members have served here for a length of time with Representative Morset. Representative Morset is often wrong, but never in doubt. And let me hasten to say, he would say the very same thing about me. And the other thing, though, that I do think oftentimes, Representative, that's not fully appreciated, he and I did have our differences. There was no one on the floor of the House that went after me harder anytime I had a bill on the floor than Representative Morset. But I will say this. I never doubted for a second every time he went after me like a duck after a June bug. I never doubted for 1 minute that he didn't respect me. I would even say, love me. And I would say as well that I love him and I will miss him. He has been loyal opposition. But there are many things that he and I agree on. And I agree wholeheartedly with his comment about the fact we do need discussion. I certainly appreciate everyone who has been here today and your contribution to this interim study. Thank you for being here, and we are adjourned.